The salt beneath the choir. The fish would not give up its brine. Wren held it flat against the slate with her left hand, thumb hooked under the gill so the cold body could not slip, and set the tip of the little bone flute against its silver flank. Halden had told her 100 times that a mackerel was easy work, the first thing any tuna should master, that a child of the marsh could wick the salt out of one before the water finished boiling. She had done it before. She was doing it wrong now. She hummed the note low in her chest, where the sealed years had not yet reached her, and pushed the resonance down the flute into the flesh. The trick was not to shout at the water. The trick was to find the pitch the water already wanted to leave at, the same way you found the loose stone in a wall by tapping until one tapped back, and then to lean on it, gently, until the brine came weeping out of the meat and beaded on the scales like sweat on a fevered brow. Do it right, and the flesh firmed and paled, and would keep a week without rot. Do it wrong. The fish shuddered under her hand. A bead of water welled at its eye, then sank back. The note in her chest had gone sharp with impatience, and she felt the flute buzz against her palm in a way that meant the resonance had slipped past coaxing and begun to force. Heat crawled up the inside of her wrist. That was the debt already starting. Her own salt answering the summons she'd meant for the fish. Her body offering up its water because she'd been sloppy about whose water she asked for. "You're crushing it," Halden said, without looking up from the far bench. "I'm not. You're crushing it and you're paying for it. Feel your lip." She touched her upper lip with the back of her hand and it came away wet, not sweat. Her nose had begun a thin, clear bleed, the kind that came when a young tuna leaned too hard on living matter and the living matter leaned back. She wiped it on her sleeve, furious in the particular way of someone who is embarrassed and 13 at once, though she was neither 13 nor strictly a child anymore. "Stop the note," he said. "All the way! Don't taper it! Stop it! Now sit with the fish a moment and do nothing." She stopped the note. The buzz died out of the flute. The cottage settled back into its ordinary sounds, the sea working the base of the cliff far below, the wind finding the gaps in the shutters, the low mutter of the driftwood fire that never quite warmed the stone. Outside, autumn had gone rotten and wet, and the storm that had been threatening since noon still had not broken, so that the whole coast lay under a bruised and waiting sky. Halden crossed the room. He was a wide, slow man gone grey, with hands too big and too scarred for the delicate work he did, and a bell-founder's deafness in one ear that made him tilt his head when he listened, as though the world were always a little to his left. He picked up the fish, turned it, set it down. He did not scold further. Scolding, he said, was for people who wanted to feel they'd done something. "Now," he said, "what did you do?" "I got impatient." "That's why." I asked, "What?" She made herself think past the shame of it. "I stopped listening for the pitch the water wanted. I picked a pitch and made the water take it." "And the water took it. And where did the difference come from, between the pitch it wanted and the pitch you gave it? That difference is real. It doesn't vanish because you're in a hurry. Where did it go?" "Into me," she said. "It came out of my own salt." "It came out of your own salt." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, quietly, so that you had to lean toward it. Every note you sing that the world doesn't already want to sing, the world charges to you. There's no honest tuning that costs nothing. There's only tuning where you choose to pay, and tuning where the cost surprises you. The first is craft. The second is how a wild singer ends up dead in a ditch with her own well run dry. He nudged the fish toward her. Again, And this time you'll hum so soft I can't hear it from an arm's length, because that's how soft a sexton needs you to be, and you should be in the habit." She wiped her lip again. She set the flute against the fish. She was aware, distantly, of the fire and the wind and the sea and the old man's patience, and beneath all of it, always, of the thing she was not to think about. That somewhere, out along the coast road, in stone towers with sanctioned bells, there were men whose whole office was to listen for exactly the sound she was about to make. Men who could stand on a cliff a mile off and hear a wild singer the way a heron hears a fish move under mud. She hummed, so low it was almost only breath. This time she did not pick a pitch. She let the note wander, searching, tapping at the water in the fish the way you tap at a wall, and when a pitch tapped back, thin, reluctant, a hair below where her impatience wanted it, she took that one and leaned on it no harder than a hand resting on a shoulder. The brine came. It came the way it was supposed to, weeping up through the scales, gathering, running off the slate in a thread of water that smelled of the sea and of nothing else. No blood, no fever, no cost she hadn't meant to pay. The flesh under her hand went firm and pale and clean. "There," Halden said softly. "That's the whole of it. That's the whole craft, forever, no matter how far you go. You listen for what a thing already wants, and you help it want that a little more. The rest is just knowing more and more things well enough to hear what they want." He took the finished fish and laid it in the crock with the others, the week's food. The whole reason they'd risk the lesson tonight at all. "The church would tell you what you just did will drown the world." "I know." "Do you know why they say it?" She did know the catechism of it, the way anyone raised on the Sindran coast knew it, the way you knew the tide tables and the names of the drowned towns. The choir of St. Vessa taught that the old world had once sung itself apart, that there had been a time when men tuned freely, changed stone to water, and water to bone, and flesh to whatever they pleased, and that their singing had so unmade the fabric of things that the sea rose and swallowed the city's whole, and only silence had saved what was left. So now the church kept the silence. It licensed every honest resonance, every founded bell and tuned lock and net charm, and it hunted down the unlicensed, the wild singers, the ones who kept the old craft alive in cliff cottages, because one wild singer, they said, was one more crack in a wall that held back the sea. "They say it because they're afraid," she said. "You've told me. Because if enough people could do what we do, they couldn't own it anymore. That's part of it." Halden went still for a moment, his head tilted to the left, listening at something she couldn't hear. Then he seemed to decide against whatever he'd been about to say. "That's part of it. There's more. And it's the part I've never told you, and one day I will, when you're ready, and not before. Because it's a heavy thing to carry, and I'd rather you carry the craft a while first, lightly, before I set the rest of it on your back." He looked at her, and there was something in his face she didn't have a name for yet. Something like a man measuring a doorway he'd have to fit a coffin through. "You've a gift I never had, girl. You hear things I have to grope for. That's a mercy, and it's a danger. The ones who hear best are the ones most tempted to stop listening and start commanding. You felt it tonight, that little jump of temper, that wanting to make the water obey. Feed that, and it grows teeth. There are notes a person can learn that feel like nothing else in the world, that make you forget you were ever afraid, and every one of them eats a piece of you to do it." He tapped her once, gently, on the breastbone. "Craft is listening. The other thing is a wolf that's learned to sing. Don't ever mistake the one for the other, no matter how tired you are." She didn't fully understand him. She would understand him later, entirely, and hate that she'd been too young to. Outside, the wind dropped. It did not gust and fall the way wind does. It dropped, all at once, the whole night holding its breath. And in the sudden quiet, Wren heard the sea again at the foot of the cliff, and under the sea, faint and wrong, a sound that did not belong to the sea at all. Bells. Not the great sanctioned tolling of a town bell, small bells, many of them, a thin, bright, irregular jangling, like harness, or like the little votive bells the sextons hung from their staves, carried on the road along the top of the cliff, still far off but coming. And with the bells, points of light. She went to the shutter and put her eye to the gap and saw them. A line of lanterns strung out along the cliff road where no honest traveller had cause to be at this hour, in this weather, moving toward the cottage at the steady, unhurried pace of men who know their quarry has nowhere to go. She had counted them before she realized she was counting. 9 lanterns. 9. Behind her, Halden had not moved. He stood by the crock of preserved fish with his big, scarred hands loose at his sides, and his head tilted to the left, listening to the little bells with his good ear, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. Not louder, not frightened, but emptied of something. The way a room empties when you take the fire out of it.
How many lights?
9. 9, he said. He drew a long breath. That's not a road patrol, girl. A road patrol is 2, 3. 9 lanterns and votive bells coming up the cliff in the dark. That's a taking party. That's them coming for a name. He turned from the crock at last and looked at her across the small, warm, ruined, ordinary room where she had spent every night she could remember, and she saw that he had already, somewhere in the last few breaths, stopped being her master and become something colder and more final. A man doing the last sums of his life and finding them, on the whole, to balance. It's my name they have, not yours. Remember that, whatever happens next. It's my name they came for. We rehearsed this, Halden said. He was moving now, fast for a slow man, pulling the loose stone from the hearthside and dragging out the oilcloth bundle he'd kept there as long as she'd been alive and never once opened in front of her. We rehearsed it and you thought it was a game, and I let you think that. It was never a game. Listen to me. Are you listening the way I taught you, or are you listening the way frightened people listen, which is not at all? I'm listening, Wren said, and heard her own voice come out thin. Good girl. He unrolled the oilcloth on the bench. Inside were 3 things: a coil of tarred rope, a fisher's short gutting knife in a leather sheath, and a small flat case of dark wood, no bigger than her 2 palms, which he pressed into her hands and closed her fingers around before she could open it. Not now, not here. These are the flutes and the striker and the wick needle. My whole kit, everything I use to touch matter without my voice. You'll need every piece, and you'll learn what the last 2 are for when you have quiet and time, and you'll have neither for a while. So put it away and don't lose it, or I'll come back from wherever they send me and box your ears. She almost laughed. It came out as a sob instead. The bells were closer. She could hear the individual voices of them now, high and cold and merry, an obscene sound, a wedding sound, coming up the cliff to kill them. Master, she said. The plan is we both go. Down the goat path, along the shingle. We hide in the sea caves till... That's the plan. That's what we said. That was the plan when I thought they'd send 3 men who didn't know the cliff, he said. He was crouched at the door now, easing it open a hand's width, reading the lanterns. They sent 9, and they came up the cliff road, not the coast road, which means they know the goat path, which means someone told them, which means there is no path down that isn't watched. He shut the door softly. You go alone, and you go the way they won't expect. Because they expect an old founder and a girl to run for the caves. And instead, the girl is going to go up, over the shoulder of the cliff, past the chalk scar, and down into the marsh country where 9 men with lanterns and bells will lose one small, quiet person in the dark. And I'm going to open this door and go out to them and make a great deal of noise. And they will be very glad to have the founder they came for. And they will not, for a while, be counting whether there was one of us or 2. No, she said. No. Yes. I won't. You will. He crossed to her and took her face in both his ruined hands, and his hands were shaking. She felt them shake, and his voice did not. There's one more thing, and you're going to hate me for it, and I need you to hold still and trust me the way you trusted me with the fish, which is more than you trust yourself. Can you do that? One last time. She could not speak. She nodded against his hands. They can hear you, he said. That's the thing you never quite believed, because you never saw it. A tuner your age, gifted the way you are, hums in her sleep. You do. You've done it since you were small, little half notes when you dream. It's nothing here in a cottage behind stone. Out there, in the open, with 9 sextons listening for exactly that sound across a mile of quiet cliff. It's a bell you can't stop ringing. It's a rope around your neck that you tighten every time you dream. His thumbs moved to the hinge of her jaw, to the soft place under her ears, and she understood, all at once and far too late, what he meant to do. So I'm going to take your voice. Not all of it, not forever. It can be undone, though it's hard and it hurts and it's dangerous, and you mustn't try it alone. I'm going to seal the singing part of your throat, so that you can breathe and swallow and live, but you cannot make a note they can hear. You'll be able to hum a little, close and quiet, enough to touch the flutes, enough to work if you're careful. But no open voice, no song, no sound to hang you by. His eyes searched hers. And Wren, there's a thing I'm going to hide in the seal, in your throat, under the silence. You won't be able to reach it, and I can't tell you what it is, because if you know it, you'll go looking for it and get yourself killed. And it isn't for now. It's for after. It's for when you're grown and ready, and someone teaches you to open your own throat. It's the rest of what I owe you. It's the reason. It's the thing I said I'd give you when you were ready. I'm not going to be here to give it to you the slow, safe way, so I'm giving it to you the fast, terrible way. And I'm sorry. And I love you. And forgive me. Don't, she tried to say. Only breath came, because he had already begun. He sang. She had never heard him sing openly. He'd taught her always in the low humming register, the safe register, the register that didn't carry. And now, at the end, he opened his voice and sang a note she felt more than heard. A note that went into the meat of her throat like a warm hand closing. And it did not hurt the way pain hurts. It hurt the way it hurts to fall asleep against your will while someone carries you. A great, heavy tenderness settling over the place where her voice lived. She felt her throat change. She felt some door in her close and, deeper behind it, felt something else lock away, small and cold and heavy, sealed under her silence like a coin sewn into a hem. She reached up and clutched at her own neck, and her mouth opened and nothing came out. Nothing. Not a cry, not his name. And the terror of it was so total that for a moment she forgot the bells entirely. Then his hands were on her shoulders, turning her, shoving her toward the back of the cottage where the low window gave onto the black, rising shoulder of the cliff. "Go," he said, "up and over and into the marsh. Don't stop for the sea. Don't stop for me. Don't hum till you're a full day gone from here, and even then only to work, only to eat, only to live. You are the last of it now, do you understand? Not the last wild singer. There are others. There are always others. But the last of mine. Everything I know is in your hands and your throat, and I am not going to let them have it." He got the window open. Cold, wet air poured in, and the smell of crushed grass and the sea. Very close now, close enough to hear boots on stone. A man's voice called out across the dark, unhurried, almost kind. "Halden Aldmere. In the name of the choir and St. Vessa. Open, and let us have the old sin quietly, and it need be no worse than it must." Halden lifted her bodily to the sill. She was not a small woman, and he lifted her like a child. For one moment his face was very near hers, and she saw that he was weeping, which she had never seen, and that he was, underneath the weeping, almost peaceful, which frightened her more than anything the whole night had held. "There's salt beneath everything, girl," he said. "That's the last lesson. Under the church, under the sea, under the drowned towns, under the whole tided coast, salt, and the old song, and the truth they buried. If you ever get somewhere quiet enough to listen, listen for it. It's been waiting a long time to be finished." He kissed her forehead once, hard. "Now be silent, and be quick, and be alive. Go." And he pushed her out into the night, and turned, and she heard the bolt of the front door draw back behind her, and a wash of merry cold bells, and his voice, his open, unsealed, no longer hidden voice, rise up in the dark, singing, loud enough for all 9 of them, loud enough for the whole coast, loud enough to fill the ears of every listener from here to the sea, so that not one of them would think to listen for a small, silent shape going up and over the shoulder of the cliff. She did not remember choosing to move. She was simply moving, on hands and knees at first through the wet black grass, then crouched, then running, up the steep shoulder of the cliff with the wooden case clutched to her chest, and the coil of rope across her body, and the little knife banging at her hip. Behind and below her, the cottage had gone from dark to firelit to something brighter and worse. She did not look back to see what was burning. Halden's song was still going. It changed as she climbed. It stopped being a song a person sings and became a song a person uses, a working note. And she heard the front of the cottage answer it with a crack like a mast breaking, and men shouting, and the merry bells scattering into ugliness. And she understood that he was fighting them, that a bell founder who had spent 40 years learning to tune bronze could do terrible things to 9 men's buckles and blades and the iron studs of their boots if he chose to spend himself all at once and never mind the debt. Because a man who has decided to die does not care what the working costs him. The song held her together as long as it lasted. She climbed by it. And then, near the top of the shoulder, with the wind coming clean and cold off the marsh country beyond, the song stopped. It did not fade. It stopped. The way the wind had stopped earlier, all at once, in the middle of a note. She froze against the wet chalk, with her cheek to the stone, and waited for it to start again. And it did not start again. The bells did not start again either. There was only the wind and the sea, and her own breath tearing in and out of the throat that would never again make a sound loud enough to mourn him. She wanted to scream his name. She opened her mouth and pushed with everything in her, and there was nothing. Only air. Only the ghost of a hum that died against her teeth, and the not being able to was so monstrous that she bit down on her own wrist to have something to feel, and tasted her own blood and salt, and understood with a cold, falling certainty that this was real, that she was alone, that the old man who had raised her and fed her and taught her to listen was gone into the fire and the silence, and that she was standing on top of a cliff on the edge of the world, with his whole craft locked in her hands and her throat, and men coming to take it from her, and no one alive who knew her name. Then, below, a lantern swung up toward the shoulder of the cliff, and a voice she did not know called out, cheerful and carrying, to men she could not see. There was a second one, a girl. He fought too well and too long for one old man protecting nothing. He was buying time for someone. Fan out! She'll have gone for the caves. They always go for the caves. But watch the high ground too, and listen. A pause. Then softer, almost lovingly, so that it carried up the cliff to her like a hand reaching for her throat. She'll be frightened. Frightened singers hum. Wren pressed her ruined throat shut with her own hand, swallowed the sound that wanted out of it, and ran. The high ground betrayed her before the sextons did. She had run north and east along the top of the shoulder, meaning to drop into the marsh country the way Halden had told her, and for a while it worked. She was quiet, she was quick, she was small, and the lanterns spread out below and behind her toward the sea caves, where Quarry was supposed to go. But the chalk scar Halden had named as her landmark was not a path down. It was a wound in the cliff, a place where the whole face had sheared away in some past storm, and where he remembered a slope she could climb. There was now only a raw white cliff, falling away into darkness, and the sound of water moving somewhere far below that was not the open sea. She stood at the lip of it, chest heaving, and understood that the coast had changed since her master last walked it. The land here was sinking. Everyone said so. The church said the drowned towns proved it. The fishers said the tide came higher up the marsh every year, and here was the proof under her own feet. A landmark turned to a trap in the space of a few storms. And behind her, closer than they should have been, 3 lanterns. They had not all gone to the caves. 3 of them had come up the high ground exactly as their captain said, and they had picked up her trail somehow. Her wet footprints in the grass, or the smell of her fear, or the small, dishonest sounds a running body makes, and they were herding her. She saw it the moment it was too late to matter. They were spread in a shallow crescent, driving her not at random, but toward something, toward the north, toward the chalk scar and the drop. And they were not hurrying. And one of them, she realized, sick, had been ringing a little votive bell the whole time, not to call the others, but to make her run from the sound, to steer her by her own terror. A shepherd's bell for a girl. She turned to face them because there was nowhere left to run to, and that was when the slingstone caught her. She never saw it thrown. There was a sound like a whip and a blow to her left thigh so sudden and total that her legs simply stopped being hers. She went down in the wet grass with a grunt she couldn't turn into a cry, and her hand slapped at the place and came away wet, and the pain arrived a heartbeat later, enormous, a hot spike driven into the muscle above her knee. Not the bone. She could still bend it, barely. But the muscle had torn around the stone's bruise, and it would not carry her weight. And the lanterns were closing, 3 of them, and the little bell went on ringing its bright, cruel rhythm, and a voice said, close and gentle, there now. Don't sing, girl, and it goes easier. Don't sing." She dragged herself backward toward the lip of the chalk scar. She got her back against the last of the solid ground and got the little wooden case out from under her arm and could not for the life of her think what she meant to do with it. There was no working she could do fast enough, no note quiet enough to save her. She was salt-strained and terrified and torn open, and her voice was sewn shut. The nearest lantern raised, and by its light she saw the man behind it for the first time. Young, plain-faced, not cruel-looking, a sexton doing his office, with a coil of tuned wire in one hand meant for wild singers' wrists, and a look on his face that was almost, God help her, pity. "Easy," he said. "Easy. It's over. You'll come with us, and it'll be as gentle as it can be. I swear it before Vessa. Just don't." She looked past him, at the two others closing, at the lanterns, at the whole certain shape of the rest of her life, which would be short and would happen in a stone room somewhere, while men who pitied her took Halden's craft out of her hands, one finger at a time. Then she looked over the lip of the chalk scar, into the dark, where far below water moved that was not the sea. "Don't stop for the sea," Halden had said. But this was not the sea. This was the thing under the sea, the thing under everything, the drowned world the church forbade the living to enter, the holy grave, the sinkhole gullet of the sunken towns. No one went into the undertide. That was the whole of the church's power on this coast, the dead world below and the sanctioned bells above, and the silence between them that only they were allowed to break. The young sexton saw where she was looking, and his pity turned to alarm. "No," he said. "No, girl, don't. That's not... You don't understand what's down there. It's forbidden. It's holy. You'll not find mercy there, only... There's salt beneath everything," Wren thought, in her sealed and silent head, in the last clear moment before the choice made itself. Somewhere quiet enough to listen. She could not scream, so she did the only loud thing left to her. She threw herself off the edge and let the drowned world swallow her whole. The fall was long enough to be a life, not long in seconds, long the way a held breath is long, the way the instant before an axe falls holds a whole childhood. Wren fell through the ragged mouth of the chalk scar, and then through nothing. Black air rushing past her ears, the lanterns above dwindling to 3 swaying stars, and then to nothing at all. And she had time to think, absurdly, that she had never learned to swim well, that Halden had promised to teach her the summer she turned 12, and then the summer had filled up with other things. And then she struck the water. It was not like striking stone, though it was close. The cold went into her like a second slingstone, into her torn thigh, into her sealed throat, into the roots of her teeth. She went down and down through black water that tasted of salt and iron, and something older, something like the inside of a bell, and her body did what bodies do, thrashing, clawing, spending itself in panic. And it was only when her lungs began to scream that the last of Halden's teaching surfaced through the terror. Listen for what a thing already wants. And she stopped fighting the water and felt, dimly, which way it wanted to lift her. She followed it up. Her head broke the surface into a darkness so total it made no difference to her eyes whether they were open or closed, and she gulped air that was cold and dead and breathable, and she got one arm over something hard, a shelf of stone slick with weed, and hung there, and did not drown. For a long time she only breathed. The water was quieter here than any sea. It lapped the stone with a small, patient sound, the sound of water that has been lapping the same stone for 1,000 years, and expects to lap it 1,000 more. There was no wind. There was no sky. There was no fire, no bells, no old man's voice. There was only the dark, and the water, and the cold, and the fact, which arrived slowly and then all at once, that she was alive, and that being alive down here might be worse than the alternative she'd jumped away from. She dragged herself out of the water onto the shelf and lay on her back and shook. Her thigh throbbed with its own heartbeat. When she pressed the wound, she felt the torn edges of the muscle move under the skin and had to bite her wrist again not to be sick. But the wooden case was still lashed against her chest. She had not let go of it, even falling. Some animal part of her keeping faith with the one thing Halden had put directly into her hands. And the coil of rope was still across her body, and the little knife was still at her hip. She had come into the underworld with all her tools and no voice, and a hole torn in her leg. And that, she understood, was going to have to be enough, because there was no one down here to make it be more. When the shaking stopped, she made herself do the thing Halden would have made her do. She took stock. She could not see, so she saw with her hands. The shelf she lay on was cut stone, not natural rock. There were edges, right angles, the deliberate flatness of a made thing. She was in some kind of chamber. When she reached up, she found a wall, and the wall had grooves in it, regular, spaced, and she traced them and found they were not grooves but letters. A script, carved deep and worn smooth, in a language she did not know, but whose shapes were older cousins of the ones in Halden's oldest books. A made place. A drowned building. She was inside the sunken world, exactly as the church described it. And it was not, so far, holy or terrible. It was just old and dark and cold and quiet enough. She thought of Halden's last words with a lurch. Quiet enough to listen. She could not stay here. The water was rising, or she was cooling, or both. Either way, she would die on this shelf of nothing. She needed light, and she needed to move. And to do either, she needed to work. And to work, she needed to know what she had to work with. She opened the wooden case by feel. Inside, nested in worn felt, her fingers found the shapes she knew. The little bone flute she'd used on the fish, and 3 others of different lengths and materials. One of dark metal that hummed faintly against her skin, as if it remembered every note ever played through it. A small iron striker, for waking resonance in things she couldn't reach with breath. And 2 things she did not know, that Halden had said she'd learn when she had quiet and time. A slim needle of pale bone or horn, with a hollow down its length, and a flat disc of some grey stone drilled through the center. She left those 2 where they lay. Quiet and time, he'd said. She had one of those now. She took out the metal flute, because metal carried in the wet, and she set it against the stone shelf, and she did the first honest work of her new life. She could not sing, but she could hum, close and low, the register that didn't carry, and she found she could push that small resonance into the flute and let the flute speak to the stone in her stead. It was clumsy. It was like trying to thread a needle wearing gloves, but it worked. She hummed against the flute and listened for what the stone wanted. And the stone, being old and made and full of remembered heat, wanted, faintly, to glow. Every worked stone did, Halden said. The making left a warmth in it that never fully died, and a tuner could coax that ghost warmth up into light if she asked it gently and paid the small cost. Wren asked. She paid, a dryness in her mouth, a tremor in the hand that held the flute, and the stone under her palm woke to a dim, sullen, blue-grey glow, no brighter than a coal under ash, but light, the first light. And by it she saw where she was. She almost wished she hadn't. The chamber was vast. The glow she'd woken was one small ember in a drowned cathedral of a room, a hall whose far walls she couldn't see, whose ceiling had partly fallen, so that black water filled half its length in a still flooded nave. Columns marched away into dark, carved all over with the old worn script and with figures, people, or things shaped like people, their faces smoothed to blanks by the patient water. The shelf she lay on was a broken gallery halfway up one wall. Below her, the flooded floor gleamed faintly where her light touched it. And beneath the surface, deep down, she could see more of the drowned hall going on and on. More columns, more figures. A whole city's worth of the old world stacked below her in the black water, like the pages of a book too heavy to lift. And carved into the wall beside her, large, deliberate, meant to be seen by whoever came into this room, by whoever fell into it, she thought. For the gallery was placed exactly where a body would wash up, was a single great figure, and around it a band of the old script, and though she could not read the words, the figure needed no reading. It was a vast thing, taller than the columns, made not of flesh, but of bells. She saw the shapes worked into its body, dozens, hundreds of bells of every size, and coral, and drowned bronze, all fused into the rough shape of something that stood upright, and had a head and had, where its face should be, only a great open mouth, and it stood, in the carving, upon a stair. A rising stair. A stair going up, out of the water, out of the dark, toward a small square at the top that the old carvers had filled with light. Wren looked at the carving for a long time. She was cold and torn and voiceless and alone in the forbidden dark, and she was a tuner's apprentice, trained to read what a made thing was trying to tell her, and this made thing was trying to tell her something as plain as a signpost. There is a way up, it said. The stair is the way up, out of the dark, into the light. And also, this stands upon the stair. This mouth stands between you and the light. A choir warden, she thought, and did not know where the word came from. One of Halden's oldest stories, maybe, told to frighten and delight her as a child, a monster of the drowned world that sang its own borders and unmade anything that crossed them. She had thought it a story. Down here, with the carving glowing sullen blue in front of her ruined eyes, it did not feel like a story. It felt like the single true fact of her situation. There was one way out of the underworld, and it was a stair, and a thing made of drowned bells stood upon the stair and sang the crosses dead. She should have despaired. She was aware that despair was the correct response, and that it was, for the moment, unavailable to her. She was too cold and too hurt, and too newly bereaved to manage anything as elaborate as despair. What she managed instead was smaller and stupider and, she would think much later, the thing that saved her. She got angry. Not at the warden, at the church, at the men who had come up her cliff with merry bells and burned the only home she'd known and put a hole in her leg and stood between her and the whole world above, and who taught, she saw it now, cold and clear, who taught the drowned world was holy and forbidden, precisely so that no one would ever come down here and see that it was just old and made and full of a lost craft, and that the way out was a stair a person might climb if she were only strong enough and clever enough to pass the thing that guarded it. The church didn't forbid the undertide because it was too holy to enter. The church forbade it because it was full of the truth about the old song, and they'd built their whole silence on top of it. The way you'd build a chapel over a well you didn't want anyone drinking from. There's salt beneath everything, girl. Under the church, under the drowned towns, under the whole tided coast. All right? Wren thought at the glowing carving, at the bell-mouthed thing on its stair. She could not say it. She thought it as loud as she could, the way she'd thought Halden's name off the cliff. All right, I hear you. Then something moved in the water below her, and she stopped thinking about the warden and remembered that there were nearer things in the dark than the guardian of the stair. It came up out of the flooded nave without a sound, which was the worst of it. A thing that big should have made some noise, and it made none. Only the water sheeting off it as it rose into the edge of her failing light. She had time to see it clearly, and wished she had not. It had been a man once, or something man-shaped. The drowned world had kept the shape and taken everything else, so that what climbed dripping onto the broken gallery below her was a husk of grey, water-swollen flesh over a frame of pale bone, its jaw hanging loose, its eyes two blank sockets that turned toward her light with the blind certainty of a thing that hunted by other senses. Salt crusted it. Coral grew from the pit of one shoulder. It had no voice and no face, and it wanted her. That much was plain in the way it heaved itself toward her along the gallery, slow and patient, and utterly without hurry. The way the men on the cliff had been without hurry. The way everything down here was without hurry, because down here there was nothing but time. Wren scrambled backward and her torn leg gave, and she nearly went into the water. She got her back to the wall beside the carving, and her hand closed on the iron striker instead of a flute, and there was no time to choose better, so she chose that. She could not sing it apart. She could not, torn and salt-strained as she was, do anything so grand. But she could do the small thing, the honest thing, the thing Halden had drilled into her 1,000 times. She could listen for what a thing already wanted, and help it want that more. And the striker in her hand wanted, when she woke it with a hum, to ring. And the stone of the gallery wanted, being old and made and full of remembered fault lines, to break. She struck the gallery floor between herself and the drowned thing. She had not the strength or the register to shatter stone outright. That was true register work, flesh and stone work, a year or more beyond her. What she could do was find the crack that was already there, the old fault the water had been working at for 1,000 years, and give it, with the striker's ring, the one small push it had been waiting for. The stone answered. It answered with a crack like the cottage door breaking, and a section of the broken gallery, already half rotten, sheared away under the drowned thing's weight and dropped it back into the flooded nave in a slough of rubble and black water. The cost hit her the instant the stone broke, the debt of a working done too fast and too hard, her own salt answering the summons she'd flung at the stone. Cramp seized her belly and her sound leg. Her nose bled again, freely this time. The blue glow she'd woken guttered and nearly died, and the dark rushed back in, and somewhere below her in the water, the drowned thing was already dragging itself back toward the broken edge, patient, unhurried, undeterred. But it had brought her the one thing that mattered, which was a start. She got the metal flute out with shaking hands and hummed the ghostlight back up out of the stone, brighter now, angry. And by it she saw the shape of the hall, and saw a passage leading off from the high gallery, going down and inward, away from the water and the drowned thing, deeper into the sunken city, toward... She had no way to know, but she chose to believe it, toward the stair. She could stay here and die on a broken gallery, or she could go down and inward, into the drowned city the church had spent 100 years forbidding, and find the rising stair and grow strong enough on the way to pass the thing that stood upon it. There was no third road. There was no going back up the chalk scar with a torn leg and no voice. There was only forward, and down, and deeper, toward the one way out. Wren pushed herself upright against the wall. Her leg screamed and held. She looked once more at the carving, the stair, the light at the top, the bell-mouthed guardian between, and fixed it in her mind the way she fixed a difficult working, as a shape she would have to earn. "I'm coming up," she thought, at the small square of carved light at the top of the stair, at the grey daylight of the world she'd been thrown out of. "It's going to take me a while, but I'm coming up, and I'm going to be worth something by the time I do. And then I'm going to find out what really happened to him. Wait for me." Then she took up her light and her tools, and her torn body and her sealed throat, and she limped down into the dark, toward the stair, and the drowned world closed over the place where she'd fallen, as if she had never been. She learned the deep the way you learn a cruel master, by being hurt until you stopped making the same mistakes. She learned that the drowned things hunted by sound and by the warmth of living flesh, and that her ghost lights, though they showed her the way to her as well, so that she learned to wake the smallest light she could bear and to quench it whenever she stopped moving. She learned that her torn leg would not heal on its own down here in the cold and wet, and that she could speed it a little by wicking the corruption out of it with the flute, the way she'd wicked brine from the fish, drawing the fever water and the bad salt out through the skin, but that every time she did, the debt came out of the rest of her, so that healing her leg a hand's breadth cost her a day's strength and left her light-headed and slow, her body's own salt running thin, a fog settling behind her eyes that Halden had warned of and called brine fog, the tuner's sickness, the price of asking your own flesh to sing. She learned to eat what the deep offered, which was little and terrible. Blind, pale fish in the flooded galleries, spider-legged things under the stones, once a drift of weed that she wicked the poison out of before she dared it. She learned to sleep in high, dry corners with her back to stone and the striker in her hand. She learned to go without the sound of her own voice, which was harder than the hunger, harder than the cold, the not being able to hum a tune to herself in the dark, the not being able to say a word aloud to break the enormous silence, the sealed throat that let her whimper and gasp but never speak, never sing, never once cry out Halden the way she needed to, so that the grief had nowhere to go and stayed in her, banked, hot, waiting. And she learned the drowned city itself, district by drowned district, and the more she learned, the more she understood that the church had lied about everything. This was no grave. It was a world. Streets and squares and workshops and temples of a people who had lived here before the water came, a people who had built in stone and worked in bronze and carved their long, patient script on every surface, and who had, everywhere, in every hall, worked their own resonance into the very fabric of the place. She began to hear it as she went deeper, a humming in the oldest stones, faint and constant, the sound of workings that had been sung into the walls so long ago and so deeply that they had never stopped. Held songs, she thought, remembering another of Halden's words. The old world had not merely tuned things and let them fade. They had learned to lock a working into matter forever, to teach a stone to glow, or a bronze door to seal, or a whole street to hold back water, and to make it hold, permanently. So that here she was 1,000 years later, walking through their held songs like a beetle walking through a cathedral, hearing the great notes still ringing in the stone. If she could learn to hear one of those held songs clearly enough, to take it into herself, the way she'd taken the small workings from Halden, then she would have inherited a piece of a lost art, a working no living tuner knew. She did not know if she could. She was a torn, half-starved, voice-sealed apprentice, and the held songs were deep, true register work and beyond, flesh and stone and water work, the kind of thing that killed the unready. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything now, as a shape she might one day be strong enough to earn. The stair, the warden, the held songs, the truth about her master. She kept them all in her, banked, hot, waiting. And she went down and down and deeper into the dark, growing stronger by the cruel measure of what she survived, until the day the deep offered her something it had never offered before, which was another living thing. She smelled it before she heard it, and heard it before she saw it, and by the time she saw it she had already begun, God forgive her, to think of it as meat. She had been 4 days without real food. She counted days now by sleeps, which was the only clock the deep allowed her. And the hunger had gone past the loud stage into the quiet stage, the stage where it stopped gnawing and started whispering, where it made reasonable suggestions in a patient voice. The brine fog was on her. Her leg had knit enough to carry her at a limp, but no further, and every working she did to hold the fog at bay cost her salt she no longer had to spend. She was, she understood distantly, dying. Not fast, not dramatically, but by inches, the way a lamp dies when the oil runs low, the flame guttering smaller and smaller until one draught ends it. So when she came into a long tidal gallery, a drowned market street where the old world had sold its wares, and heard a sound ahead that was not water and not stone, and not the dry scrape of a drowned thing, but a living sound, a wet, labored, rhythmic breathing, and under it, a low keening that vibrated in her chest more than in her ears. The hunger sat up and took notice before the rest of her did. Something breathes, the hunger said reasonably. Something that big and that alive is a great deal of meat. She crept toward it with the striker in one hand and the gutting knife loose in its sheath, and she woke her light no brighter than a coal, and she came around a fallen column into the tidal gallery, and saw it, and stopped. It was enormous. It filled the flooded end of the gallery, a long, sleek, dark body half in the water and half hauled out onto a shelf of stone. And her first mad thought was, whale. But it was no whale. It had limbs, 4 of them, webbed and clawed, and a broad, blunt head with small dark eyes and a fringe of whiskers and a thick tail that lay useless in the water. And its whole body was covered in a short, dense pelt that shed the water in sheets, so that it was something between a seal and an otter, and a thing that had no name in the world above. It was young. She could see that even in her ignorance, in the too large softness of its head, the not yet filled out looseness of its skin. And it was trapped. A great iron grate, part of some old sluice work of the drowned street, had fallen across the shelf of stone, and one of the creature's hind limbs and the root of its tail were pinned beneath it. And the creature had clearly been fighting the grate for a long time, because the stone around it was scored with claw marks, and the limb beneath the iron was torn and bleeding into the water. And the low keening she'd heard was the sound of an animal in pain that has stopped expecting the pain to end. Meat, said the hunger. Meat that can't run. Come the mercy of it, girl. It's dying anyway, pinned like that. You'd be doing it a kindness, and yourself a life. One clean stroke behind the head. Wren took a step toward it, with the knife half drawn, and the creature's head came up, and its small dark eyes found her light, and it looked at her. She had been prepared for it to look like an animal. It did not look like an animal. It looked at her the way a person looks at another person across a room, with a whole mind behind the eyes, with fear and calculation, and a terrible, exhausted hope. And it made a sound, not the keening, a different sound, sharper. And something happened that she had no framework for at all. It pushed at her. Not with its body was pinned. It pushed at her with pressure, with a sudden wall of the water itself, the whole flooded end of the gallery flexing at once so that a swell rose out of nothing and shoved against her, staggering her. And with the swell came an impression, dumped directly into her mind without passing through her ears. A blast of raw feeling, terror and warning, and a bright animal no, so vivid and so unlike anything she had ever received that she cried out silently and fell back a step, and her light guttered, and for a moment she and the creature stared at each other in the near dark, both of them shaking, both of them cornered, both of them afraid. And in that moment, the hunger's voice, which had been so reasonable, went quiet, because the creature had done the one thing that made it impossible to eat. It had spoken to her, not in words, but that had been a no, unmistakably, a person's no, a mind's no. And Wren stood in the drowned market, with a knife in her hand and a starving body, and heard, under the hunger, under the fog, in the sealed and silent place where her own voice used to live, Halden's voice, from years ago, telling her a story to frighten and delight her. And the reef folk hold the grails sacred, girl, the whale otters of the deep reefs, because a grail has a soul as good as yours, and to kill one is to murder a person, and the sea remembers it. A grail. She was looking at a grail. The sacred sea beast of the reef faith, the intelligent people of the deep, revered by the drowned world faiths the church had spent a century burning. And here was one, young and lost and pinned and dying in the forbidden dark, exactly as lost and pinned and dying as she was, looking at her with a person's frightened eyes and pushing her away with the only voice it had. Wren looked at the knife in her hand. The hunger made one last suggestion, quieter, ashamed of itself. She did not listen to it. She sheathed the knife. And then she did the thing that she would understand much later had decided the whole shape of her life. She did not turn and leave the sacred creature to die under the iron, which would have been the safe thing and the church-taught thing and even, in a bleak way, the kind thing. She set down her striker and held up her empty hand so the grail could see them empty, and she limped, slowly, in the plainest and least threatening way she could manage, toward the fallen grate. The grail flinched and pushed at her again, a smaller swell this time, uncertain. She stopped. She waited. She pointed at the grate, at the pinned limb, and mind lifting, and pointed at the grate again, and did not know if a grail could read a gesture but tried anyway, because she had no voice to explain herself, and gesture was all she had left. And the grail went still, and watched her, and its small dark eyes went from her empty hands to the grate, to her face, and back, and slowly, slowly, the wall of pressure it had been holding against her eased, and it made a low, uncertain sound that was not the keening and not the sharp warning, a sound she chose to hear as, try, then. The grate was iron and old and vast, and she could not lift it. There was not strength in the whole drowned world's worth of her starving body to lift it. But she did not need to lift it. She needed to make it want to break. She knelt by the grate with the metal flute, and this was going to cost her more than she had. She knew that going in. Iron was harder work than the soft, old, cracked stone she'd been breaking. Iron was a real material, a true register material, and she was a low-register apprentice on the edge of collapse. But she had wicked her own leg and eaten poison weed, and walked 4 days into the underworld on a torn muscle and a locked throat. And she had discovered, somewhere in all that the edge of her ability was further out than Halden had ever let her go, because Halden had loved her and kept her safe, and the deep did not love her and kept her nothing. She had been pushing past her old limits for days now, one desperate working at a time, and she was, though she did not have the word for it, climbing. Her register widening under pressure, the way a muscle widens under load, ugly and unstable and real. She set the flute to the iron and hummed, close and low, and listened for what the iron wanted. The iron wanted, she found. All worked iron wanted, deep down, having been forced out of the honest ore and hammered against its will into a shape. The iron wanted to fail, to rust, to flake, to return to the red earth it had come from. It had been wanting that for 1,000 years in the wet dark, and the old world's makers had sung it into holding anyway. And their held song had faded, here, in this humble sluice grate, as it had not faded in the great walls. So that the iron's want to fail had crept back, patient, waiting for someone to lean on it. Wren leaned on it. She found the pitch the iron's failing already sang at, thin, sour, deep below where her comfort lived, and she reached for it. And it was too low for her. It was down in the true register where she had no business being, and she reached anyway, straining her sealed and humming throat to its ragged edge, pouring resonance through the flute into the iron. And for one terrible moment, nothing happened except the cost. The debt came due all at once, her own salt tearing out of her in answer, cramp folding her double, the brine fog crashing down over her sight, so that the whole gallery swam and darkened, and she felt something in her throat tear a little further under the strain. A hot wrongness where the seal met the working. And then, just as she thought she would black out and die, kneeling with her flute against a grate for a creature she'd meant to eat, the iron answered. The pitch caught, the want to fail woke all along the grate at once, and the whole iron structure gave a groan, and then a sharp, bright crack, and sheared through in 3 places where its rust had eaten deepest, and the weight came off the grail's pinned limb, and the grail, feeling it, heaved with all its great young strength, and dragged itself free of the broken iron into the water in a surge that swamped Wren where she knelt, and put out her light entirely. She fell back into the dark, spent past spending, her salt run dry, the fog total. And she felt something happen in the deep of her that she would learn later to name and fear. A small, permanent change, a scar. The iron's failure written now into her own flesh where she had over-tempered it, forced a permanence her body would carry, a dullness in one edge of her register that she would never quite get back. Halden had warned of that too. Force permanence, and it marks you. She was too far gone to care. She lay in the black water with her cheek on wet stone, and waited to find out whether she had spent her life freeing a creature that would now, freed, remember she'd come at it with a knife. She could not wake a light. She could not lift her head. She lay in the dark and heard the great body move in the water, close and closer, and she thought, with the last clear scrap of her mind, well, at least it isn't the church. At least it isn't the church that ends me. And something touched her, not teeth. A blunt, broad head, wet and warm, pushed gently against her shoulder, and then against her cheek, snuffling, careful, the way a horse noses at a fallen rider, the way a dog checks whether its person is still there. The Grail had not fled. The Grail had freed itself and turned back, and was pushing its head against her in the dark, and pushing too at her mind, Not the wall of terror now, but something lower, softer, a warmth, an impression she had no words for, but that she received anyway as clearly as speech. Alive? Alive. Stay. Stay. Wren could not answer. Her throat was sealed, and her body was empty, and her light was gone. But she lifted one shaking hand in the dark and laid it flat against the warm, wet fur of the creature's head, and left it there. And the Grail went still under her hand and did not pull away. And the two of them stayed like that a long time in the drowned dark, the starving, voiceless girl and the freed, sacred beast. Neither one alone any more for the first time in a long time. An unspoken truce made in the one place in all the world where no one was watching to forbid it. She did not die that night. The Grail would not let her. She surfaced slowly out of the fog, over what might have been a day, and every time she surfaced, the Grail was there, and it had, in its blunt animal wisdom, done the one thing that could save her, which was to bring her food. It dove into the flooded gallery and came back with fish, whole, fat, blind, pale, deep fish, and dropped them by her hand, and pushed them at her with its nose, and pushed at her mind. Eat. Eat. Until she understood, and ate, raw and shaking, and the salt and the meat went into her empty body and pulled her back from the edge she'd been over. She wicked the worst of the corruption from the Grail's torn limb in return, when she was strong enough to sit up, the two of them working out a wary reciprocity in the dark. She had hands and a craft, and could clean and close a wound. It had strength and speed, and the water at its command, and could feed them both. Neither could have lived alone in the deep. Together they were, barely, possible. She learned its speech a little over that long recovery, or it learned to speak to her. She never after could say which. It could not make words, but it could make impressions, pushed through the water and into her mind, and they had a grammar of a kind. Warmth for safety and reassurance, a bright, hard pressure for danger, a curling inward feeling for hunger, a specific, cold, hollow ache she came to understand with a pang, for alone, for home, for the reef it had been swept away from and could not find its way back to. It was young and it was lost, exactly as she was young and lost. And it had been down here in the dark far longer than she had, and the cold, hollow ache of its loneliness was the one impression it pushed at her most, again and again, until she understood that the thing that had nearly broken this creature was not the pinning iron or the hunger, but the being alone, the being the only one of its kind in a drowned world, with no voice to answer its voice. She could not tell it in words that she understood, because she understood that better than anything, because her own aloneness had a shape exactly like that cold, hollow ache. But she could lay her hand on its head in the dark, and she could stay, and she could push back at it, clumsily, with the only impression she had learned to send in return, a small warmth of her own. Here, here, not alone. Here. And the Grail would go still under her hand, and the cold, hollow ache would ease, and for both of them, the dark got a little less total. And on the day she was strong enough to stand, and to wake a light, and to look at the long tidal gallery in the passage leading down and inward toward the stair she still meant to find, she looked at the Grail, and the Grail looked at her, and she pointed down the passage into the deeper dark, and mind walking, and looked a question at it. I have to go on. I have to find the stair. Will you come? Or will you stay in the water you know? And the Grail did not hesitate. It heaved itself off the shelf, and into the flooded channel that ran down the passage's side, and swam a few lengths, and stopped, and turned its blunt head back to her, waiting, and pushed at her mind one warm, certain impression, the clearest it had ever sent. Together. The drowned district ended in a plaza, and the plaza is where the truce became something with a name. It had been a grand place once, a public square of the old world, ringed with the fronts of buildings whose purposes she could only guess at. A colonnade here that might have been a market, a broad flight of steps there rising to a doorway carved with the patient script. A dry fountain in the center, whose basin now held only silt and the bones of drowned things. Water filled the lower third of the plaza in a still black sheet, and the Grail swam it easily, while Wren picked her way along the raised colonnade at the edge. And for a while it was almost peaceful, the two of them crossing the drowned square together, her small light throwing their shadows up the ancient walls. She had been learning to move with the Grail, and it with her. Days of the deep had taught them a rough choreography. She took the dry high ground and the narrow places where hands and a craft mattered, and it took the water and the open places where strength and speed mattered. And they had learned to trade the lead back and forth without needing to discuss it, which was as well, since they could not. She had grown steadier since the great. The near death had, in the cruel arithmetic of the deep, made her stronger. Her register had settled wider than before, the true range no longer entirely beyond her, though she paid for every excursion into it. And the over-temper scar from the iron ached in the wet, like an old wound predicting rain. She could wake brighter lights now, hold them longer, and work small changes in non-living matter almost without thinking. She was still a torn, half-starved, voice-sealed apprentice, but she was a torn, half-starved, voice-sealed apprentice who had killed a drowned thing with a broken gallery and freed a sacred beast from iron with her own failing throat. And she carried herself, now, a little differently for it. Which was perhaps why she was not paying close enough attention when the drowned came. They came out of the flooded doorways all around the plaza at once, and there were many of them. Not one scavenging husk, but a pack, a dozen or more. The grey, water-swollen shapes heaving up out of the black water and off the drowned steps and out from behind the columns, all converging on the two warm, living things that had blundered into their square. Wren had time to understand that this was a different order of threat than the lone thing on the gallery. That a dozen of them meant she could not simply break a floor and be done, and then they were on her. What happened next, she could never afterward reconstruct as a sequence of choices. It happened too fast and too much at once. She knew that she got the striker up and broke the colonnade under the nearest three, dropping them into the flooded plaza in a slew of stone. She knew that the cost of it staggered her, and that two more came at her along the intact colonnade, while she was still folded over the cramp. She knew that she was going to die there, pinned against a drowned wall by two grey, patient husks, and that her light was guttering, and that this was, in the end, a stupid way to go. Killed by dead men in a dead city, for the crime of wanting to see the sky again. And then the water rose. The whole flooded plaza rose at once, called up out of nothing the way the Grail had shoved the swell at her on the day they met, but vastly more. The Grail had learned, or grown, or was simply spending itself the way she spent herself, and it flung the entire black sheet of the plaza upward in a wall of water that took the two husks off their feet and off the colonnade and flung them broken against the far wall. And the same wall of water caught Wren too, but gently, a cupped hand rather than a blow, and set her stumbling back onto the high, dry steps, where the striker was some use again. The Grail surged up out of the churn between her and the rest of the pack, huge and dark, and no longer young-seeming at all. its blunt head low, its dark eyes lit with something that was not fear, putting itself bodily between Wren and the drowned, and it pushed at her mind not warmth now, but a bright, hard, ringing pressure. Danger. Together. Fight. And Wren got her legs under her and understood that the creature had just saved her life, and that it was now, absurdly, one Grail against a pack of drowned men, and that it could not win that alone any more than she could. So they did not fight it alone. They fought it together, and in the fighting discovered the thing that would, at the very end, save them both. Wren could not fight the pack, but she could shape the ground they fought on. And the Grail could not fight the pack alone either. It was young and strong, but there were too many, and a husk that got its dead grip on the Grail's throat would not be shaken off. But when Wren broke the drowned steps to channel the water, the Grail was in the channel. When the Grail flung a husk against the colonnade, Wren had already tuned that stretch of stone brittle so that the wall came down on top of it. When 3 husks came at the Grail together through the flooded center, Wren stilled the water there. Her first real use of the still song adjacent working, the calming and hardening chord Halden had begun to teach her, sung low through the flute so that the black water in the fountain basin firmed toward slush, and then toward a treacherous gel that fouled the husk's footing. And the Grail took them one at a time while they floundered. She listened for what the fight wanted, and helped it want the shape she needed. And the Grail was her hands and her strength in the water, while she was its cunning and its craft on the stone. And between them, over a long and terrible and strangely exhilarating stretch of minutes, they unmade the pack. When it was over, they stood, she on the broken steps, it in the churned and reddened water, both of them heaving, both of them hurt, the last husk twitching and stilling in the slush of the fountain. And Wren looked at the Grail across the wreck of the plaza, and felt something she had not felt since the cliff, since before the cliff, since the ordinary, warm, ruined nights in the cottage that were gone forever. She felt, for one clear moment, glad. Glad to be alive, glad to have won, glad not to have won alone. And the feeling was so unexpected and so enormous that it undid something in her, and she found, to her own astonishment, that her shoulders were shaking, and that the shaking was not fear or cold, but something that in a person with a voice would have been laughter. A silent, gasping, ridiculous, helpless laughter. The laughter of someone who has been carrying grief like a stone for weeks and has just, for one instant, set it down. The Grail watched her shake and laugh silently on the steps, and it did not understand. And it pushed at her a question, a wary, curling, "What? What is it? Are you hurt?" And she could not explain. So she did the only thing she could. She waded down off the steps into the churned water, right up to the great, warm, blunt head, and she put both her arms around it as far as they'd go, which was not far, and she pressed her face into the wet fur of its neck, and laughed and wept at once, silently, her whole body shaking with it, and pushed at its mind the warmest, largest, clumsiest impression she had ever managed. Glad, glad, thank you, glad, not alone, glad. And the Grail went very still, and then, slowly, curled its head around her, and held her, and pushed back a warmth of its own that was so like relief, so like belonging, so like the easing of a cold, hollow ache it had carried far longer than she'd carried hers, that they stood there together in the bloody water in the dark of a drowned plaza, and simply held on to each other. 2 lost young things who had found, against all sense and against the whole weight of the church and the sea and the drowned world. One other person. When she finally let go and stepped back, wiping her face, she looked at the creature. Really looked, in the light of her own working, at the young Grail who had freed her and fed her and fought beside her and held her while she wept without sound. And she knew she could not go on thinking of it as the Grail, as the creature, as a sacred abstraction out of Halden's stories. It was a person. It was, she had decided somewhere in the last few minutes without deciding it, her person. The first she'd had since the cliff and maybe the only she'd ever have again down here. And a person needed a name. She looked at it, and she looked at the barnacles that crusted the old stone of the fountain, the humble, stubborn little creatures that clung to the drowned world and held on and would not be shifted no matter what the tide did. And it was a foolish name, a child's name, a name with no dignity to it at all. But that was rather the point, she thought. There was too much dignity down here, too much holy, forbidden weight. The church had made the whole underworld solemn, and she wanted one thing in it that was hers, and warm, and a little bit silly. She pointed at the Grail, and then laid her hand flat on her own chest, the gesture they'd worked out for I, me, mine. And then she pointed at the little clinging shells on the fountain's rim, and then back at the Grail, and pushed at its mind the sound of the word as best she could shape it without a voice. The feel of it, the two blunt syllables, and looked a question at it. The Grail considered the barnacles on the fountain. It considered Wren. It pushed at her mind, cautiously, an impression that she chose to read as bemused, and then, deciding, it pushed back the same two-syllable feel she'd sent it, clumsy and pleased, claiming it. Barnacle, then, if you like. Barnacle. And pushed underneath it a warmth so uncomplicated and so total that it went into her chest like the sun she had not seen in weeks. Barnacle, she said, in the sealed and silent place behind her ruined throat, and meant it like a vow. And so it was Wren and Barnacle who left the drowned plaza together, down the deeper passage toward the stair. No longer a girl who had freed a beast, and a beast that tolerated a girl, but a pair, a company, a found and unlikely kinship in the dark, and neither of them yet knew how deep that kinship would have to run, at the very end, on the last stair, to save them both. They went deeper, and they grew, and the deep tried harder to kill them. Time lost its shape entirely down there. Wren measured the journey in sleeps and in fights, and in the slow widening of what she could do. And by all three measures, it was long. The drowned districts changed as they descended. The humble market streets and dwelling places of the upper city gave way to grander and stranger works, temples and halls, and vast engineered spaces whose purposes she could not fathom. All of it more deeply carved, more densely worked. The held songs in the stone humming louder the deeper they went, as though she were descending not merely through a sunken city, but through the strata of the old world's craft, from the small tunings of ordinary life down toward the great foundational workings on which the whole place had been built. And she learned. Necessity taught her faster and crueler than Halden ever had. She learned to fight with her craft, which Halden had barely let her practice, to break ground and still water, and turn stone brittle in the middle of a killing fight, to manage the salt debt across a long engagement so she didn't spend herself empty in the first minute, to read a drowned hall the way she'd learned to read a fish, and know before the fighting started where the old faults ran and where the water wanted to go. She learned to work in concert with Barnacle so completely that the two of them stopped needing even the rough sign language they'd built. A fight became a wordless duet, Wren shaping the ground and Barnacle shaping the water, and both of them held together by the low, constant hum of impression that ran between them now whenever they were near. The warmth and the danger pressure, and the small private jokes that had somehow accreted between a voiceless girl and a wordless beast, until they had a whole language made of nothing but feeling and trust. Her register widened. The true range, once a place she could reach only in extremity and pay agony for, became somewhere she could visit. She could work bone now, and reliably work iron, and she began to understand that the ordinary boundary Halden had drawn around her, under register, low register, the safe apprentice's range, had been a fence built out of love, and that the deep had torn the fence down and left her growing wild and fast and dangerous, across ground her master would never have let her onto. She thought about that often. She thought that if she ever climbed out of here, she would be something Halden had not made and had not meant to make, something the deep had made out of what Halden gave it, and she did not know whether he would have been proud of that or afraid of it. And there was no way ever to ask him, and the not knowing sat in her banked and hot with all the rest. And she began, faintly, to hear the held songs as more than a hum. It came to her first in a great domed hall, so deep that the water pressed cold against her chest, even on the high walkways. A hall that must have been a place of worship or of power in the old world, whose every surface was worked so densely with the patient script that the carving itself seemed to move in her light. Standing in the center of it, still, listening, she had learned to listen the way Halden taught, for what the made thing wanted, only now she turned that listening on the drowned city itself. She heard, under the general hum, a single held song rise clear for a moment, a great slow working sung into the very foundation of the hall, a note that had been holding something in place for 1,000 years. And for one instant she almost caught what it was holding, almost understood the shape of the working, the way you almost catch a word in a language half learned, and then it slid away from her, too deep, too old, too far beyond her ragged, true register, and she was left standing in the cold water, with a sense of having brushed the hem of something enormous. A held song, she thought, with a lurch of longing and fear. If I could take one of those into me, if I could learn even one of the old world's workings whole. She did not know yet what it would cost. She did not know yet that she would need one, and need it badly, before the end. She only knew that somewhere below her, in the dark, the drowned city was still singing its ancient workings, still holding up whatever it had been built to hold up, and that the deeper she and Barnacle went, the louder those songs grew, and the closer they came to the two things she was descending toward: the rising stair, and the truth about the old world song that the church had drowned 100 years of the living to keep buried. Barnacle pushed at her mind, from the water below the walkway. Come, come, why do you stop? Why do you stand and listen to the stone? And she went to him, and they went on, down, toward the deep places where the drowned city's own dead did not go, toward the foundry district where the old world had cast its bells, and toward the pressure, mounting fight by fight, sleep by sleep, that would drive her at last to reach for the one note Halden had begged her never to sing. The pressure that broke her had a simple shape, too many in too tight a place, with Barnacle out of the water. They had come to a drowned stair hall, a place where the old world had cut a great flight of steps down through the living rock to reach a lower district, and the steps were dry. The water had drained away below into some deeper level, leaving the whole vast stairway open to the air for the first time in Wren's descent, which meant Barnacle could not swim it. He could haul himself down the dry steps on his four webbed limbs, slow and awkward and utterly out of his element. But he could not use the water, and the water was the greater half of what made him formidable. So that on the dry stair, he was only a large, frightened animal, a long way from anything he could shape. And the drowned found them there. Not a pack this time, a congregation. That was the word Wren's mind reached for, seeing them pour down the upper steps and up the lower ones in the same moment, the two grey tides converging on the exposed stair, with the two warm, living things caught between them. Dozens of husks, more than she had ever seen at once, drawn from half the district by the noise of Barnacle's clumsy descent. There was no floor to break here that would not drop them both into the same trap. There was no water to still. There was only the dry stone stair, and Barnacle stranded on it, and the grey tide rising from both directions, and Wren in the middle, with a striker and a flute, and a widening register that was not, she understood in a cold plunge of certainty, wide enough. She could kill 5. She could kill 10 if she spent herself to the edge of death. She could not kill dozens, and even if she could, the first one to reach Barnacle where he crouched, exposed and slow on the dry steps, would set its dead grip on his throat, and that would be the end of the only person she had. She fought, anyway. She broke the stair above them to slow the upper tide, and it cost her, and it slowed them by moments only. She got her back to Barnacle's flank, and worked the flute in a blur, brittling the stone under the nearest husks so they crashed through. Wicking nothing now, spending recklessly, her nose streaming blood, cramp climbing her legs, and still they came. And one got past her guard and lunged for Barnacle, and Barnacle reared and flung it off the stair with his blunt head, but took a raking gouge across the shoulder for it, and screamed. The sharp keening she'd heard on the day they met, the sound of pain that has stopped expecting to end, and pushed at her mind a blast of pure terror, the old cold terror of being alone in the dark, of dying alone in the dark. And Wren felt that terror go into her and marry her own, and something in her, cornered, exhausted, out of salt, out of options, out of everything except the will to keep this one warm creature alive. Something in her reached, without deciding to, for the note Halden had begged her never to sing. She knew it the way you know a cliff edge in the dark, by the feel of the ground falling away. Halden had never taught it to her. He had refused, absolutely, the one thing he ever refused her. But he had told her of it, to warn her from it. And in the telling he had described its shape so exactly that she had always, secretly, known she could find it, if she ever wanted to badly enough. There are notes a person can learn that feel like nothing else in the world, that make you forget you were ever afraid. And every one of them eats a piece of you to do it. The breaking note. Not the honest listening for what a thing wanted, its opposite, its inversion. The note that did not ask a thing what it wanted, but told it. That did not coax matter toward a new want, but simply shattered the want it had. That unmade rather than made. It was forbidden not because the church forbade it, the church knew nothing of it, but because Halden did, because he had felt its pull, because it was the wolf that had learned to sing. And it was, she found, right there. It had been in her throat all along, under the seal, waiting, the way she'd always suspected. The seal that stopped her open voice did not stop this. This did not need a voice. It needed only the will to stop listening and start commanding. And she had that will now, cornered on a dry stair, with her whole heart about to be torn out of her by dead men. She reached for the breaking note, and she found it, and she sang it, not with her sealed throat, but with something under it, something older, a resonance she pushed out through the flute and through the striker and through her own bones all at once. And the world came apart. It was, exactly as Halden had promised, like nothing else in the world. The fear went first, all of it. The terror for Barnacle, the terror for herself, the grinding, exhausting fear she'd carried since the cliff. The fear that was the water she'd been swimming in for so long she'd forgotten it was there. All of it simply stopped, wicked out of her the way she wicked brine from a fish, and in its place came a vast, cold clarity, a rightness, an ecstasy of capability so total that she nearly wept from the relief of it. She was not afraid. She would never be afraid again, and she was strong. The breaking note poured out of her and touched the grey tide, and the grey tide came apart, husk after husk after husk, not thrown or broken or drowned, but unmade, their dead cohesion simply ceasing, the resonance that held their swollen flesh together shattering at the note's command, so that they folded and slumped and fell to grey ruin on the stair. All of them, the whole congregation, in the space of a few heartbeats, while Wren stood in the center of it, untouched and unafraid, and gloriously, terribly, wholly free. She could have gone on. That was the thing she would remember after with the most horror. That when the drowned were all down, when the stair was clear and Barnacle was safe, and there was nothing left to unmake, the note did not want to stop, and she did not want to stop it. It wanted the stair. It wanted the walls. It wanted the held songs humming in the deep stone. Wanted to reach down and shatter every working the old world had ever made. Wanted to unmake the whole drowned city, and the sea above it, and the church above that. And standing in the center of that wanting, Wren felt no reason at all why she should not. Why she should ever again do anything but this. Why she had spent her whole life listening and coaxing, and paying honest costs, when she could simply command. And Barnacle bit her. Not hard, but real teeth, closing on her arm above the wrist, sharp enough to break the skin. And the pain of it and the shock of it broke the note, and the world came back. The stair, the grey ruin, her own body, which she now discovered was screaming at her from a dozen directions at once. And Barnacle, his teeth still on her arm, his dark eyes fixed on her face from a hand's breadth away, pushing at her mind an impression she had never received from him before and hoped never to receive again. Not danger, not fear for himself, but fear of her, a bright, hard, recoiling no. The same no he had thrown at her on the day they met, when she had come at him with a knife, and under it, worse, a question, small and horrified. Where did you go? Your eyes went away. You went away. Come back. Come back. Wren came back. She sat down hard on the ruined stair, among the grey remains of the congregation, and she shook. And the fear came flooding back into her all at once, all of it. The fear the note had wicked out, returning with interest, and she was more afraid than she had ever been. Not of the drowned, who were dealt with, but of herself, of what she had felt, of how good it had felt, of the fact that Barnacle had had to bite her to bring her back, and that she had not, in the moment, wanted to come back. She got her unbitten arm around his neck and pressed her face to his fur and shook, and pushed at him the only thing she could. Here, back, sorry, back, here. And Barnacle held very still, and slowly, warily, unbit her arm, and pushed back a wary, uncertain warmth, forgiving her and not forgiving her, glad she was back and frightened of where she had gone. She checked herself for cost when the shaking eased, the way Halden had taught her to check after any working. Her body's debt was enormous. She'd spent salt she didn't have and would pay for days. But her body was not what she was afraid for. She reached inward for the other cost, the one Halden had warned of. Every one of them eats a piece of you to do it. And she groped through her own memory for what the note had eaten, and found nothing. Everything seemed to be there. Halden's face, the cottage, the fish on the slate, the lessons, the cliff, his hands on her jaw, his voice singing loud in the dark so she could get away. It was all there. She had gotten away with it. She had used the forbidden note and paid only the ordinary salt debt, and lost nothing of herself at all. And the relief of that was so great that she almost laughed her silent laugh. And she thought, he was wrong, or he exaggerated to frighten me off it. It doesn't eat you, or it doesn't eat you if you're strong enough to stop. And I stopped. Barnacle stopped me, but I stopped. She was wrong. She did not know yet how wrong. The note had eaten something small this time, so small she would not notice its absence for a long while. A single thread pulled from a tapestry she was not, in that moment, looking at closely enough to see the gap. She thought she had gotten away with it. That belief, I got away with it, it doesn't cost what he said, was the most dangerous thing the note had done to her. More dangerous than the small thing it had quietly taken, because it was the belief that would let her reach for the note again. But Barnacle knew. Barnacle had seen her eyes go away, and Barnacle was not fooled by the fact that she seemed, after, to be all there. When she had stopped shaking and cleaned the bite he'd given her, and they had climbed down the ruined stair away from the grey remains, Barnacle stopped her, in the dark, at the bottom, and pushed at her mind with great deliberation, slowly, making sure she understood, a single, sustained impression. The memory of her eyes going away, and the fear of it, and then, unmistakably, a no, a demand, a plea, a rule laid down between them. Not again. That. Not again. Promise. Not again. And Wren, who loved him and who was ashamed, and who did not yet believe in her heart that the note had cost her anything, pushed back the warmest, most solemn yes she could manage. Yes. Not again. Promise. Never again. And meant it, entirely, in that moment. And knew, underneath, in the place where she was honest with herself, that she was not sure she could keep it, because she had felt the note now, and nothing else in the world felt like it, and the deep was not done with them, and there would be another stair, another congregation, another moment with Barnacle's life in the balance, and she did not know, when that moment came, whether she would be strong enough to let herself be afraid. They went on into the dark, the promise made and already fragile between them, and above them the held songs hummed in the drowned stone, and ahead, though they did not yet know it, the water carried the far-off sound of a place where the old world had once cast bells. The foundry city announced itself as heat, which was the last thing Wren expected in the drowned dark. They came down out of the stair districts into a level where the water ran warm. Not warm as a half is warm, but warm as a stone is warm that has been in the sun. A ghost of heat that should have died 1,000 years ago and had not. And Wren, wading into it, understood before she saw a single carving that she had reached one of the great held songs at last. Something down here was still hot. Something down here had been sung hot in the old world and had never been allowed to cool. and the warmth of it seeped up through the water and the stone across a whole drowned district. And that district, when her light finally found the shape of it, was a foundry. It was vast beyond the temples, vast beyond the domed hall. The old world had cast its bells here, and it had cast them on a scale that made Wren's throat ache with a grief she could not name. For the church, the choir of St. Vessa, hung its sanctioned bells in every tower on the coast, and taught that the founding of bells was its own most sacred art, licensed and guarded and holy. And here below the sea was the place the church's whole art had come from, a foundry city where the old world had poured bronze into molds the size of houses, and the church had drowned the knowledge of it and forbidden anyone to come and see. She waded through the warm water, past the drowned casting pits, past molds still half full of bronze that had cooled 1,000 years ago into malformed bells never rung, past the great channels where molten metal had run, and everywhere the held songs hummed loudest of all. Because this was a place built on resonance, a place where the makers had sung the heat into the metal, and the shape into the bronze, and the voice into the bell. And their singing was still going on, faintly, in the fabric of the ruined works, so that the whole drowned foundry murmured to itself in the dark, like a choir that had forgotten it was dead. And the foundry was inhabited. The congregation here was worse than any she had met. A great standing host of the drowned, gathered in the central casting hall around the largest mold of all, motionless, ranked, as though they had assembled to hear a bell rung that would never be rung. Hundreds of grey husks packed into the drowned foundry in a stillness more terrible than any charge. Wren, seeing them from a high gallery above the casting hall, went cold and low and quenched her light to a coal. And Barnacle went still in the warm water beside her, and the two of them lay in the dark above the congregation, and understood that they could not fight through that. There was no breaking a host of hundreds, not honestly, not without reaching again for the note, and she had promised, and Barnacle was watching her, and she would not. So they did the other thing, the thing the deep had taught her, the thing that was slower and harder and cost more time than force. They went around, section by drowned section, gallery by gallery. They learned the foundry the way she had learned everything down here, by inches and by fear, threading the edges of the great congregation, taking the small, scattered husks in the outer works 1 and 2 at a time, in quick, brutal, wordless efficiency. Wren's craft and Barnacle's water grown so smooth together now that a lone husk in a side gallery was dealt with almost before it registered as a threat, and never, never rousing the great host in the center. And in the working of it, the long, patient, dangerous threading of the drowned foundry, 2 things happened that mattered more than any fight. The first was that Wren began to understand what she wanted her craft to be. It came to her in the outer works, in a chamber where the old founders had kept their tools, tuning tools like Halden's but grander, flutes of bronze the length of her arm, and strikers she could barely lift. All of them worked and held so that they still hummed faintly when she passed her hand near them. She stood among the old founders' tools and felt the difference between them and the note. These makers had spent their lives listening. She could feel it in the tools, in the held songs, in the whole vast, honest labor of the drowned foundry, listening for what bronze wanted, and heat wanted, and the great bells wanted, and coaxing all of it over lifetimes into works so true they had outlasted the world that made them. That was the craft. That was what Halden had given her, and what the deep had grown wild and dangerous, but had not, underneath, changed. And the note was the betrayal of all of it. the refusal to listen. The wolf, standing among the old founder's tools, warm water to her chest, the held songs humming around her, Wren made a decision that had been forming since the stair hall, that she would be a maker, that whatever the deep had turned her into, she would turn it toward listening and not commanding, toward the honest cost and not the ecstatic theft, toward Halden's craft and not the note, and that if she could not pass the warden as a maker, then she would find another way, or she would not pass it at all, because passing it as the other thing would cost her the very self she was climbing out to keep. She did not know yet how hard that decision would be to hold, but she made it among the old founder's tools, and it was a real decision, and it changed her. The second thing was that she found the bell. It was in the deepest of the outer works, past the last of the scattered husks, in a chamber Wren almost did not enter, because the held song coming from it was so loud it frightened her. Not a hum now, but a sound. A great, slow, sustained resonance she could feel in her teeth and her breastbone and the wound in her leg. A working so vast and so alive that standing in its doorway was like standing at the foot of a waterfall. And in the chamber, alone, hung a single bell. It was enormous, and it was cracked, and it was the source of everything. This was the first bell, she understood somehow, or one of the first. The great mother bell of the whole foundry, and the old founders had not merely cast it, but had sung a held song into it, the deepest and truest, working in the whole drowned city. And then the world had ended, and the sea had come, and the bell had cracked, a long, jagged fault down one side, and the crack had not silenced the held song but changed it, so that for 1,000 years the great cracked bell had hung here, singing a working that was almost, but not quite, whole. And the working it sang, Wren realized, standing in the doorway with the sound in her bones, was a listening. That was what the old founders had put into their mother bell. Not a working that commanded matter, but a working that heard it. A resonance that reached out and listened for the true want of everything around it. The perfected form of the craft Halden had spent his life on. The held song of listening itself. If she could learn it, if she could take that held song into herself, whole, the way she'd taken small workings from Halden, she would have the old world's own art of listening. The ability to hear the true resonance of any made thing, its held songs, its faults, its wants, its whole hidden voice. She would be able to hear a thing so deeply that she could unmake it not by shattering, not by the note, but by finding the one true resonance that was already its undoing, and simply singing it back to the thing until the thing came apart along its own honest fault. A way to break without breaking herself, to win as a maker and not as a wolf. It was exactly, precisely, the thing she would need to face the warden. She did not know that yet, standing in the doorway. She only knew that the held song was there, and vast, and cracked, and that learning it would cost her more than anything she had ever done. She waded into the chamber, and set her hands and her flute against the great cracked bell, and began, very carefully, to listen. It nearly killed her, and it marked her, and in the end she took it. She could not simply pluck the held song out of the bell. A held song 1,000 years old, sung into a mold the size of a house by a whole choir of the old world's masters, was not a fish's brine to be wicked in an afternoon. She had to learn it the way she'd learned everything, by listening for what it wanted and helping it want that more. And what the cracked bell wanted, she found, was to be whole. It wanted to complete the working the crack had broken, and she could not make it whole. That was beyond her, beyond any living tuner, the mother bell of a drowned world. But she could do the smaller, stranger thing that learning it required. She could sing along with the held song, matching it note for note as far as her ragged register could reach, and where the crack broke the working, she could fill the break with her own resonance, holding the working whole for a moment, a single moment, long enough for the completed held song to sound through her, into her, so that she carried its shape away even after she let the bell fall back to its broken singing. She reached and could not match it. It was too deep. The held song lived down in the far end of the true register and reached below into ranges she had no name for, ranges the seal in her throat made almost impossible. And she strained against the seal until she tasted blood and could not reach the bottom of the working, and the bell sang on, whole in every part but the one she could not fill, taunting her with the completeness she couldn't hold. And Barnacle helped her. He could not sing, but he could feel the working. She saw it, in the way he had gone still in the water of the chamber, his blunt head raised, his dark eyes half closed, listening to the held song in whatever way a grail listened. And she understood, slowly, that he heard it more clearly than she did. The reef folk lived in the deep. The grails swam the drowned works. Whatever sense let Barnacle push impressions through water and read the terror of a husk before it moved, that same sense let him hear the mother bell's held song whole and true, down into the ranges she could not reach. And so they did the thing they had learned to do, the thing that was the seed of everything to come. Wren listened through Barnacle. She pressed her hand to his neck and reached into the low, warm hum of impression that ran always between them now. And instead of sending, she received. Let his hearing pour into her. Let his clearer sense of the held song fill in the ranges her sealed throat could not reach. And with his hearing added to her own, she found, at last, the bottom of the working, the deep note the crack had broken. And she filled it with her own resonance, and for one single ringing eternal moment, the mother bell of the old world sang whole through the two of them, the girl and the grail, the maker and the reef child. And the held song of listening sounded complete for the first time in 1,000 years. And Wren caught it. She caught it, and it went into her, and the cost came due all at once. The salt debt was enormous, worse than the stair hall, worse than anything. She spent herself, grey and empty, holding the working whole, and would pay for it for days in fever and fog. But the salt debt was not the mark. The mark was the over-temper. She had forced a permanence, had made her body carry a working it was never meant to hold, and it wrote itself into her the way the iron grate had, only deeper. She felt it settle, a change in her hearing, a new depth to it. The held song of listening now hers, permanently, a lost art inherited whole, and she felt what it cost to carry it, a scarring in her register, a place where her range would never again quite ring true, the price of holding 1,000-year-old working in a living throat. Halden had warned of that too. She was marked now, twice over, iron and bell, her craft grown vast and her instruments scarred to buy it. And she understood for the first time in her body, and not just her mind, what he had meant. That every real power cost a real piece of you, and that the only question was ever whether you paid it honestly, listening, or stole it with the note. She had paid honestly. She had the held song of listening now, the old world's own art of hearing, and she had bought it with salt and scar and Barnacle's help, and never once reached for the note. And that mattered. That mattered more than she could say, because it proved the decision she'd made among the Founder's tools was possible. That there was another way, a maker's way, a hard, slow, costly way to grow strong that did not require becoming the wolf. But when the working was hers, and she had stopped shaking, and Barnacle had fed her, and she had come back a little from the grey edge, they climbed to the high gallery above the great casting hall, and she used her new hearing to listen out across the drowned foundry toward the deeper districts beyond, hunting the resonance of the rising stair. And she found it. Far off, at the very edge of her new, deepened hearing, past the foundry, past the last of the drowned districts, she heard the stair. She heard the held song of the rising stair itself, the old world's working that had cut a way up out of the dark toward the light. And she heard, standing upon it, singing, vast and slow and patient and utterly deadly, filling the whole deep end of her hearing with a resonance that unmade everything it touched. The choir warden. She heard it clearly now, with her new court listening, the great drowned construct of fused bells and bronze and coral, and the held song bound into its own frame, the working that made it, that held it together, that let it sing its territory to death. She heard, in the warden's own held song, the fault line, faint, deep, real. The one true resonance that was the warden's own undoing, if only she could reach it. If only she could sing it back to the thing until the thing came apart along its honest fault. And she heard, with the same terrible clarity, that she was not strong enough. Not yet. Her register even deepened, even carrying the held song of listening, could not reach the bottom of the warden's fort. It was deeper than the mother bell, deeper than anything. Down in the ranges only Barnacle could fully hear. And to reach it, she would need not just Barnacle's help, but something more than they had ever done. Something the low, warm hum of impression between them only pointed toward. She had the tool now, the listening, the maker's way to unmake. She did not yet have the reach, and between her and the stair lay the last of the drowned districts and its horrors, and the certainty, cold in her new, deepened hearing, that she would be pushed to the edge again before she got there, and that at the edge, the note would be waiting, patient as the deep, whispering that it could reach anything, that it could unmake the warden in a single breath, that all she had to do was stop being afraid. Wren looked at the far resonance of the warden on its stair, and she looked at Barnacle beside her, warm and whole and watching. And she pushed at his mind the shape of what she'd heard. The stair, the warden, the way up, and under it the shape of what she'd decided. As myself. I pass it as myself, not the other thing. As myself, or not at all. And Barnacle pushed back a warmth that was fear and trust and love all at once. And they went down off the gallery together, past the great motionless congregation, out of the foundry city, and into the last dark before the stair. The causeway was where she broke her promise, and where she learned at last what the note truly cost. Beyond the foundry, the drowned districts gave out into a great flooded gulf, a place where the floor of the old world had collapsed into some deeper dark, and the only way across toward the stair was a causeway, a raised stone road, narrow, ancient, running straight across the gulf on a series of drowned arches, with black water on either side falling away into depths Wren's light could not reach. It was a choke point of the worst kind, a single narrow road with no room to maneuver, no floor to break that would not drop them into the gulf. Water on both sides, but water too deep and too open for even Barnacle to command, and no way across but forward, in the open, in single file, with nothing to hide behind and nowhere to run. She hated it the moment she saw it. She listened across it with her new hearing and found it clear. No husks on the causeway itself, and let herself believe for one foolish moment that they might simply cross. They started across. They were halfway. The drowned arches falling away black on either side, the stair's resonance louder now ahead, almost close, almost within reach, when the gulf gave up its dead. They came up out of the black water on both sides of the causeway at once, hundreds of them. A horde such as even the Foundry congregation had not been. The drowned of the whole collapsed district, rising, streaming out of the depths and hauling themselves up the drowned arches onto the narrow road ahead of and behind the two living things caught in the middle. There had been no husks on the causeway because the husks lived in the gulf, and Wren and Barnacle had walked out into the center of their whole drowned world, and were now surrounded on a strip of stone barely wide enough to stand on, with water on both sides too deep to fight in, and the horde closing from both ends at once. Wren fought. She fought as she had never fought, with everything the deep had taught her and everything the Foundry had given her. She used the held song of listening to hear the drowned as they came, to hear the faults in their swollen frames, and she sang those faults back at them, unmaking them 1 and 2 and 3 at a time, not with the note, but with the maker's way, finding each husk's own true undoing and singing it. And it worked. It worked beautifully. It was the very thing she had climbed and bled to learn. But it was slow, and the horde was fast and vast, and for every husk she unmade honestly, 2 more hauled up onto the causeway, and the maker's way, the listening way, the honest way, was simply too slow to hold back a tide. And Barnacle, stranded on the narrow stone with no deep water to shape, could only fight with his body, and his body was one body against hundreds. And Wren, in the middle of singing a husk's fault, heard him scream. She turned. A knot of the drowned had reached him from the far end of the causeway, 3, 4, 5 of them, and one had its dead grip on his throat, and another was raking his flank open, and he was rearing and thrashing and could not shake them. And he pushed at her mind not the old terror of being alone, but something worse, something final, the impression of a young creature that knows it is about to die. A bright, fading no, and under it, unbearably, a warmth turned toward her, even now, even dying, a last, you, at least you, glad it was you, not alone at the end. And Wren stopped being afraid. She did not decide to. There was no decision in it. There was only Barnacle dying, and the horde, and the maker's way too slow to save him, and the note right there where it had always been, under the seal, patient, whispering, I can reach them all. I can unmake this whole horde in a breath. All you have to do is let go. All you have to do is stop being afraid. And she let go, and she stopped being afraid, and she sang the breaking note into the drowned gulf with everything in her. The world came apart, ecstatically, exactly as before. The fear went. The horde came apart. Not 1 and 2 now, but all of them. The whole vast tide, hundreds of grey husks unmade in a single sustained breath of the note, folding and slumping and falling from the causeway back into the black water they'd risen from. And the ones on Barnacle fell too, their dead grip failing, their swollen flesh losing its cohesion all at once, so that he heaved free of them, bleeding and alive. Alive. She had saved him. The note had saved him. And standing in the center of the cleared causeway with the whole horde unmade around her, Wren felt the vast, cold, glorious clarity pour through her, and did not want it to stop. And this time, there was no barnacle to bite her, because Barnacle was down and bleeding at the far end of the road. And she stopped it herself. That was the thing she would hold on to after, in the ruin of what followed, that she stopped it herself. No one bit her. No one brought her back. She heard, through the note's cold ecstasy, some small, honest maker's part of her that she had built among the founder's tools, some part that had decided she would not be the wolf. And that part said enough. He's safe. Stop. And she, clawing, straining, against a current that did not want to be fought, she stopped the note. The fear came back. The world came back. And she checked herself for cost, the way she always did, the way Halden had taught her. And this time the cost was not nothing. She reached inward for what the note had eaten, and she found the gap. It was small. It was so small that a person not looking for it might live a whole life and never find it. But she was looking for it, because she had promised Barnacle and broken the promise, and needed to know what the breaking had cost. And so she found it. A hole where a memory of Halden had been. Not a large memory, not his face, not his voice, not the cliff, not the cottage. Those were all still there, and the relief of that was so great she almost missed the hole entirely. What was gone was a lesson, a specific lesson, a specific afternoon. She could feel the shape of its absence the way your tongue feels the socket of a pulled tooth. There had been a day, she knew there had been a day, when Halden had taught her something, sat her down and taught her some particular thing about the craft, something that had mattered, and she could no longer remember what it was, or when, or what he'd said, or how his hands had moved, or what she'd learned. There was only the socket where it had been. The note had reached into her and pulled that one thread from the tapestry of everything Halden had given her, and pulled it clean, so that she would never know what she had lost, only that she had lost it. Only that a piece of her master was gone from her forever, and had gone to buy the unmaking of a hoard. She sat down on the cleared causeway among the black water and the memory of the fallen dead. And she understood. She understood the whole of it at once, everything Halden had tried to warn her from, everything the note truly was. It did not merely feel like nothing else in the world. It ate you. It ate the very thing she had thrown herself off a cliff to protect, the very thing she was climbing out of the dark to keep alive. Halden's craft, Halden's self, Halden's whole inheritance living on in her memory. And it ate it, a thread at a time, painlessly, invisibly, so that a person could use the note again and again and always find, checking after, that they seemed to be all there, that they'd lost nothing they could name, right up until the day they realized they could no longer remember the face of someone they had loved, or the lesson that had made them who they were, or why they had ever been afraid of a note that only ever gave and gave and gave. The note was not a wolf that would tear her open where she could see the wound. It was a wolf that ate her from the inside, quietly, one memory at a time, and left her feeling stronger every day, until there was nothing left of the girl who had loved an old man on a cliff, but a very powerful thing that unmade whatever it touched, and remembered nothing worth keeping. She had used it to save Barnacle. She would do it again to save Barnacle. She knew that about herself now, coldly. But she also knew, sitting on the cleared causeway with the socket of the lost lesson aching in her, that she could not use it against the warden, because the warden was not a moment's crisis. The warden was the whole climb's end, the thing she had bled and grown and inherited a held song to face, and to face it with the note would mean holding the note not for a breath, but for a battle, would mean paying not one thread but a fistful, would mean coming out the other side of her victory if she survived it, having lost so much of Halden that the very self she was climbing out to keep would be gone. She would win and be no one. She would reach the surface, a powerful, empty, unmade thing that could not remember why it had wanted the surface at all. She would not do that. She would rather die on the stair as herself than climb it as the note's creature. She crawled to Barnacle at the far end of the causeway, and he was badly hurt. The throat grip had not crushed him but had torn him, and his flank was raked deep, and he was frightened. And when she reached him, he pushed at her mind first a warmth, relief, alive, you're back, alive. And then, seeing her face, seeing whatever was in it, the wary, fearful question again. Your eyes went away. Again. You promised. Again. And Wren, this time, did not send back a sorry or a never again. She had made that promise and broken it, and she would not make it again lightly. Instead, she did the hardest thing, the honest maker's thing. She opened the low, warm hum between them all the way, wider than she ever had, and she showed him the truth. She showed him the note, and how it felt, and how it had saved him, and then, carefully, so he would understand, she showed him the socket where the lesson had been, the hole in Halden, the thing the note had eaten, and under it, her own horror and her own resolve, and she pushed at him, slowly, the shape of what she had decided on the causeway. It saves us, and it eats me. It ate a piece of him. I can't use it on the warden, or I climb out as no one. I have to find another way. Help me find another way. Don't let me reach for it again unless we are dying. And if we are dying, she made herself send it truly. If we are dying, I would rather lose a piece of him than lose you. But only then, only dying. Help me hold to that. Barnacle received all of it. He was quiet a long time, in the dark, on the causeway, bleeding. And then he pushed back at her the most solemn impression she had ever felt from him, slow and deep and certain. A vow to answer her broken vow. I watch. I hold. I bite if you go too far. I keep you, you. That is mine now. I keep you, you. And Wren pressed her face to his torn neck and began to wick the corruption from his wounds, and wept without sound, and knew that she had found, in the worst moment of the whole descent, the one thing that could get her up the stair as herself. Not a working, not a held song, not a wider register, but a person who would keep her a person. A bond that would hold her to herself when her own strength failed. The very thing the church forbade, and the reef faith held sacred, and the deep had given her. Someone to be strong with, so that she never again had to be strong in the terrible, self-eating, solitary way of the note. They did not go on at once. Barnacle was too hurt, and Wren was too spent, and more than that, something between them needed mending that was not a wound of the body. They sheltered past the causeway, in a dry, drowned chamber Wren's hearing found safe, and for a long while, 2 sleeps, 3, they simply healed. Wren wicked the corruption from Barnacle's torn flank and throat a little at a time, paying the salt debt slowly, letting her own grey emptiness refill between workings. And Barnacle brought her fish from the gulf and kept the warmth flowing between them, and neither of them pressed toward the stair, because both of them understood, without a way to say it, that they were not ready, not their bodies, which would mend, but the thing between them, which the note had cracked. Because the note had cracked it. Wren felt the crack every time she looked at Barnacle, and remembered the fearful question in his eyes. Your eyes went away. again. And every time she reached inward and touched the socket where Halden's lesson had been, she had broken a promise to him. She had, in the breaking, damaged the very inheritance she'd sworn to protect. And Barnacle had watched her do it, twice now. Had watched her become for a few breaths a cold, unmaking thing that did not know him. And though he had chosen to keep loving her, to keep her, the choice had cost him something too. A certainty. A trust that had been simple and was now complicated. The trust of a young creature who had believed his person was wholly safe, and now knew that his person carried a wolf inside her that might, in the worst moment, turn even on him. They had to make that right, or they would climb the stair as two damaged things instead of one whole bond. And the whole climb had taught Wren that two damaged things did not survive the deep. Only the bond survived the deep. So she did the slow, honest work of it, the way she did everything now. She could not apologize in words, but she could open the hum between them and stay open, keep nothing back, let Barnacle feel everything in her all the time, not just the warmth she wanted to send, but the fear underneath, the temptation still whispering, the shame, the grief, the socket in her memory, all of it. No more hiding the ugly parts behind a scent smile. If he was to keep her, he had to know all of her, the wolf as well as the maker. And so she stopped protecting him from the wolf and simply showed it to him and trusted him with it and let him decide, knowing everything, whether he still wanted to keep her. And Barnacle, given the whole truth, chose again. Slowly, over the sleeps in the dry chamber, the wary complication in him eased, not back into the simple trust of before, which was gone, but forward into something sturdier, a trust that had looked at the worst and stayed. He pushed at her, once, the shape of it, the clearest thing he'd ever sent. Not "you are safe," which was no longer true, but "you are worth the danger." I know the wolf now. I keep you anyway. I keep the maker and I watch the wolf. Both. You are both and I keep both, and I hold you to the maker. And Wren understood that this was better than the old, simple trust. This was a real thing, a thing that had been tested and had held, the kind of bond you could take up a stair against a warden. She used the healing time for one thing more. She listened, again and again, with her new court-held song of listening, across the last dark toward the stair and the warden. And she studied it, the way she'd studied the carving on the first day, the way she'd studied any hard working, as a shape she had to earn. She listened to the warden's held song until she knew it, until she could have hummed its outermost ranges, until she understood exactly what it was. And what it was, she came to understand over those long listenings, was not a monster. The warden was a made thing, like the mother bell, like the whole drowned city, a construct the old world had sung into being and set upon the stair. And its held song was not malice, but purpose. It had been made to guard the stair, to keep the deep sealed from the light, and the light from the deep, to stand at the one way up and let nothing pass. It was a caretaker. It sang its territory to death, not out of hunger, but out of office, the way the sextons had come up her cliff with merry bells out of office, doing the thing they were made to do. And Wren felt a strange, cold kinship with the thing she had come to unmake. It was the old world's sexton. It kept the old world's silence. And she was, exactly as she had been on the cliff, a small, living thing that wanted only to get past the guardian to the light, and that the guardian, faithful to its office, would sing to death without hate and without mercy, because that was what it was for. She heard, over and over in her listenings, the one fault in the warden's great held song, the deep, true resonance that was its own undoing, the note that, sung back to it, would make it come apart along its honest fault. She heard it, and knew she could not reach it. It lived below even the mother bell's depths. Down in the ranges only Barnacle could fully hear. And to sing it, she would need not just Barnacle's hearing lent to her as she'd borrowed it at the mother bell, but something more, something total. She would need to hear as Barnacle, to reach through him all the way down into the deep ranges and sing from there, which was a thing they had never done, a thing that was not lending, but joining, a thing the low, warm hum between them only gestured at. And she understood, listening, healing, mending the bond in the dry chamber, that this was the whole shape of the ending waiting for her. That she would face the warden, and the note would be there, whispering that it could unmake even the warden in a breath. That all she had to do was pay the last of Halden and stop being afraid. And that the Maker's way, the honest way, the only way that would let her climb out as herself, would require her to do the thing they had never done, to join with Barnacle so completely that she could reach the deep fault of the warden's held song and sing it back to the thing until the thing came apart. And that this joining, whatever it was, would be the true bond, the soul bond the reef faith spoke of, the thing that would tie her to Barnacle past any parting, and that she did not know if they could do it, and that if they could not, she would die on the stair, or worse, break and win as the note's creature, and lose the last of the old man she loved. She showed all of that to Barnacle, too. She showed him the fault she'd heard, and the depth she couldn't reach, and the joining that might reach it, and the risk of it, and the price. And Barnacle, when he understood, did not hesitate any more than he had hesitated on the day they left the plaza together. He pushed at her the same warm, certain word he'd sent then, the word that had made a company of a girl and a beast, only deeper now and final. Together. And under it, the thing that made her weep, all the way down. I hear the deep. You sing it. We do it together or not at all. I would rather go all the way down with you than stay safe apart. Take my hearing. Take all of it. I am not afraid to be joined to you, Wren. I have wanted to be joined to you since the plaza. Reach through me. Sing the warden's fault. And if it kills us together, which is the only way I want to die. They rested one sleep more, until Barnacle's wounds had closed enough to bear the fight, and Wren's salt had refilled enough to spend. And then they made ready. Wren took out the two tools she had never used, the ones Halden had said she'd learn when she had quiet and time, the hollow bone needle and the drilled grey stone. And she listened to them now with her held song of listening, and understood them at last. The needle was for the throat, a founder's tool for the delicate work of unsealing, and the stone was its anchor. And together they were the means, dangerous and costly, of opening a sealed voice. Halden had put them in her kit, knowing she would need them. Knowing that one day, to face what waited at the bottom of the deep, she would have to sing openly again. Not the small, close hum the seal allowed, but her full voice, her whole register, reaching down through Barnacle into the deep fault of the warden's song. And that no one would be there to unseal her, so she would have to do it herself, the fast, terrible way, exactly as he had sealed her. She could not do it fully. Unsealing all the way was beyond her, alone, in the dark, and would kill her. But she could do it part way. She could open the seal enough to loose her voice into the high register, enough to reach further down than the hum allowed, enough, with Barnacle's deep hearing joined to hers, to reach the warden's fault. It would hurt. It would cost. It would tear at the place where Halden's craft was sealed, might even loose before she was ready, whatever heavy hidden thing he'd locked away in her throat under the silence. She did not care. She had climbed a whole drowned world to face the thing on the stair, and she would face it with her own voice, partway loosed, joined to Barnacle, as a maker and not as the note. Or she would not face it at all. She set the founder's needle to her own throat in the dark, and Barnacle pressed close, and she pushed at him one last impression before she began, not fear, not doubt, but a warmth as large as the one he'd first sent her in the drowned market. Together, then, all the way down. Thank you for keeping me. Let's go up. And she began, carefully, in agony, to open her own sealed throat. And her voice, silent for so long, for the whole long descent, came back to her in a thin, loosed thread of high-register song, ragged and painful, and hers. And with it, the seal cracked part way, and something behind the seal shifted, the heavy, hidden thing Halden had locked there, stirring toward the light. And Wren swallowed the pain, and rose, and turned with Barnacle toward the last dark, and the rising stair, and the warden that stood upon it, ready at last, as herself, to climb. The stair rose out of the deep like the last idea of the old world. They came to it through a final drowned gate, and beyond the gate, the drowned city simply ended. The packed districts, the causeways, the foundries, all of it gave way to a single vast open shaft going up. A wound cut clean through the living rock, from the deep dark toward, impossibly far above, a smudge of grey that was not light and not dark, but the memory of light. The first not black Wren's eyes had seen since the chalk scar swallowed her. And up the center of the shaft, spiraling, ancient, sung into the rock by the old world as its one road between the deep and the sky, rose the stair. It was broad enough for 10 to climb abreast. It was worn smooth by 1,000 years of water. It went up and up and up toward the grey memory of light, and it was, in every carving and every held song still humming in its steps, exactly what the first day's carving had promised: the way out. And at its foot, filling the base of the shaft, singing, stood the warden. It was worse and grander than the carving. It was worse and grander than her listenings had prepared her for. It rose out of the black water at the stair's foot, like a cathedral that had learned to stand. A colossus of fused bells, hundreds of them, thousands, drowned bronze of every size, welded and grown together over a frame of ancient iron and threaded through with a millennium of coral, so that it was at once metal and living reef, at once made and grown, at once a machine and a thing. It had the rough shape of something that stood upright, with a body and limbs and a great blunt head, and where a face should be, it had only a mouth, a vast open bell mouth from which its song poured. And the song was death. Wren had heard it in her listenings, but hearing it and standing in it were not the same. The warden sang its territory, the whole base of the shaft, the first 100 steps of the stair, and its song was a held working of pure unmaking, a resonance that reached into any living matter that crossed into its territory and sang that matter's cohesion apart, gently, patiently, faithfully, the way a sexton's tuned wire found a wild singer's wrist. Anything living that came within the reach of the warden's song would simply, over a span of breaths, come undone. The water in it drawn out, the flesh unsung, The self dissolved back into the salt and stone of the deep. It did not charge. It did not hunt. It stood at the foot of the stair and sang, and its song was the wall. And to reach the stair, Wren and Barnacle would have to cross into the song and survive it long enough to do what could not be done quickly. Wren, standing at the drowned gate at the edge of the warden's territory, her throat partway unsealed and aching, her voice loosed into a thin, high thread, listened to the death song with everything the deep had given her, and made herself see it whole, and found the fault. It was where she'd heard it in her listenings, deep, deep down at the very bottom of the warden's held song, the one true resonance that was the whole construct's own undoing. For the old world had made even its guardians honest, had built into the warden, as into everything, the fault along which it would come apart if ever the right note were sung back to it. She could hear the fault. She could not, alone, reach it. It lived below her loosed high register, below even where the founder's needle had opened her throat, down in the deep ranges only Barnacle could fully hear. And the note was there. Of course the note was there. It rose in her the moment she stood in the warden's death song and felt the first cold tug of the unmaking reaching for her own flesh. The note, whispering its old ecstatic promise, I can unmake it in a breath. I don't need its fault. I don't need to reach anything. I unmake by command, not by listening. I can shatter the whole warden the way I shattered the horde. All you have to do is stop being afraid. All you have to do is pay. And she felt how easy it would be, how the note would win instantly, how she and Barnacle would be past the warden and up the stair and into the grey light in the space of a single breath, if she would only reach for it. And she would come out the other side, no longer herself. She would pay not a thread of Halden, but a fistful, a battle's worth, because unmaking the warden with the note would take far more than unmaking a horde. She would climb into the grey light, a powerful, empty thing that could not remember the old man's face. She had decided this on the causeway. She decided it again now, standing in the first cold reach of the death song, with the note whispering and Barnacle warm and afraid beside her. No, as myself, all the way down together, or not at all. She pushed at Barnacle the shape of it. Now. The fault is down where only you can hear it. I open all the way to you. You open all the way to me. We join, all the way down. And you must not let me reach for the note, no matter what it does to us, even if we are dying. This time, not even if we are dying, because to beat the warden with the note is to lose him entirely. And I would rather lose everything than lose him entirely. Hold me to the Maker, all the way down, together. And Barnacle pushed back the last together of the whole long descent, and they crossed into the warden's death song, and the ending began. The song took them the moment they crossed. Wren felt her own cohesion begin to sing apart, felt the death song reach into her flesh and find the water in it and begin, patiently, faithfully, to draw it out, to unsing her. The same working she'd used on a fish's brine turned on her whole living body, and the pain of it was enormous and strange. Not a burning or a tearing, but a loosening, a sense of her own edges going soft, herself beginning to dissolve at the seams. She had a span of breaths, not more. In a span of breaths, the death song would unmake her, and Barnacle beside her, and she had to reach the fault and sing it back before it did. And the fault was too deep, and there was no time, and the note was screaming its easy promise. And she opened the bond all the way, and joined with Barnacle, and everything changed. She had never done it. No one, perhaps, had done it in 1,000 years. A tuner and a grail, a maker and a reef child, joined not in the low, warm hum of shared impression, but wholly. Two hearings become one, two selves reaching into one another all the way down. It was not like lending. When she had borrowed Barnacle's hearing at the Mother Bell, she had stayed herself and taken a little of his sense. This was not that. This was pouring herself into him and letting him pour into her. So that for the span of the ending, she was not Wren listening through Barnacle, but something that was both of them at once. A single, joined thing that had Wren's voice and craft, and Barnacle's deep hearing and command of water, and, under everything, both their whole hearts. The girl who had thrown herself off a cliff to keep an old man's craft alive, and the young grail who had been swept from the reef and found, in a voiceless girl in the dark, the only person who could answer his loneliness. Joined, they were vast. Joined, Wren could hear as Barnacle heard, all the way down into the deep ranges, down to the very bottom of the warden's held song, down to the fault. And joined, Barnacle could hold her to herself. That was the thing she understood in the joining, that she had not understood before. The thing that made the whole bond more than a tactic. With Barnacle inside her, with his whole heart poured into her alongside her own, the note's promise lost its terrible, solitary pool. The note had always whispered to her alone. It offered the strength of the solitary self that needs no one. The strength that does not have to be afraid because it does not have to care. But she was not alone in her own self anymore. Barnacle was in there with her, warm and certain and unafraid of the wolf, holding her to the maker, and the note, whispering its promise of a strength that needs no one, found no one to whisper to, because there was no one alone in Wren anymore for it to seduce. The bond did not merely give her the reach to sing the fault. The bond made her, for the span of the ending, immune to the note, not because she was strong enough to resist it, but because she was no longer alone enough to want it. She reached down, through Barnacle, through the joined vastness of the two of them, all the way to the bottom of the warden's held song, and she found the fault, and she sang it. She sang it with her own loosed voice, partway unsealed, ragged and painful and hers, reaching down through the bond into ranges her sealed throat could never have touched alone. And Barnacle's command of water carried the resonance through the death song's own medium, so that her singing of the fault rode the warden's territory back into the warden itself, the guardian's death song becoming the road along which its own undoing travelled. She sang the warden's fault back to the warden. She did not command it. She did not shatter it with the note. She listened it apart, found the one true resonance that was the great construct's own honest undoing, the fault the old world had built into even its guardian, and sang that fault until the warden came apart along it, the way she'd unmade a single husk on the causeway, only vast, only the whole cathedral of fused bells and drowned bronze and 1,000-year coral coming undone along its own true fault. The maker's way, the honest way, the way that cost her salt and scar and everything but not one thread of Halden. It cost everything else. Holding the fault song against the warden's death song, in the joined vastness, for the long, terrible span it took the colossus to come apart. The salt debt was beyond anything, beyond the Mother Bell, beyond the hoard. And she spent herself grey and then past grey, spent salt she did not have, felt her own body begin to fail even as the death song's unmaking still reached for her, so that she was being unsung from without and emptying herself from within at once. And she held, and Barnacle held her, and the warden came apart. It came apart slowly, and then all at once. Bell after bell fell silent as its fault reached them, the great death song breaking into pieces, into discord, into a vast tolling collapse as the fused colossus lost the held song that had made it one thing and became, again, what it was built from: 1,000 drowned bells, a frame of ancient iron, a millennium of coral, all of it coming apart and falling with a sound like the end of the world, back into the black water at the foot of the stair, the guardian of the deep, unmade at last, along its own honest fault, by a girl who had refused to become a wolf. And in the last moment of it, as the death song broke and the warden fell, Barnacle was hurt. Wren felt it through the joining, felt it as if it were her own body, which, for that span, it nearly was. A falling piece of the collapsing colossus, a great mass of fused bronze and coral, coming down through the black water where Barnacle held himself, holding the resonance, holding her, all the way down, and unable in that instant to shape the water to save himself, because every part of him was pouring into the joining, into keeping Wren reaching the fault, into keeping her. He could have saved himself and lost the fault. He did not. He held all the way down, and the falling mass of the dying warden came down on him and drove him under and broke him, a grievous, crushing wound down his whole length. And Wren felt it through the bond as the last bell fell silent, and the death song ended, and the warden was gone. The song ended. The unmaking stopped reaching for her. She was empty and dying, and the fault was sung, and the warden was down, and the stair, at last, lay open. The rising stair, spiraling up out of the deep toward the grey memory of light, unguarded, clear. The way out. She had climbed a whole drowned world to reach. She had won. She had won as herself, with every thread of Halden intact, the note refused, the Maker's way held to the end. And Barnacle was broken in the black water, and the joining was still open, and she felt him dying. She half fell, half swam to him through the ruin of the warden, the loosed thread of her voice failing, her body grey and past grey, and she got to him where he lay crushed and sinking, and she felt through the bond that he was going, that the falling bronze had broken something in him that would not mend on its own, that he had spent the last of himself holding her to the fault and to herself, and had nothing left, and that he was afraid, not of dying, she felt, but of the old cold thing, the being alone in the dark. Don't want to go back to alone. Stay. And Wren, empty, dying, with nothing left to spend, spent it anyway. She had no salt left. She poured out what wasn't there. She turned everything the deep had given her, the held song of listening, her loosed voice, her whole scarred vast register, the joining itself, onto the one working that mattered, the wicking and closing and stilling and mending of Barnacle's broken body, listening for what his failing flesh wanted, which was to live, to hold together, to stay, and helping it want that with everything she was, paying a cost her emptied body could not pay, so that the debt came not out of salt she didn't have, but out of her own self, her own life, the last of her, poured into keeping Barnacle alive because she would not climb into the grey light having won and lost him, having beaten the warden and kept every thread of Halden, and lost the one person who'd kept her a person. That was not victory. That was the note's victory by another road, and she refused it. She mended him. Barely. Enough, she felt, through the fading joining, his broken body catch and hold and begin, slowly, to knit. Not healed, grievously hurt, but no longer dying, no longer sinking, no longer going back to alone. And she felt his fear ease, and his warmth turn toward her one more time, faint and grateful, and afraid for her now, for the girl who had emptied herself past empty to keep him. Stop, you're going too. Stop, I'm held. Stop. And she did stop, because she had nothing left to give, even if she had wanted to give it. And the joining, its work done, began to close. But it did not close all the way. That was the last thing she understood before the grey took her, that the joining, having been opened all the way down, having held two selves as one through the unmaking of a guardian and the mending of a mortal wound, did not, when it was done, close all the way back. Something in it had set, the way an over-tempered working sets, the way the held song of listening had set into her scarred register. She and Barnacle had reached all the way into one another, and some part of that reaching had become permanent. A low, warm thread, running now not just between them when they were near, but through them, always. A joining that had become a bond that had become, in the Reef Faith's old forbidden word, a soul tie, so that she would never again be wholly alone in her own self, and neither would he, and the note would never again find a solitary wren to whisper to, because there was no solitary wren anymore. There was only Wren and Barnacle, joined past any parting, the girl and the grail, made kin down in the deep where no church could forbid it. She had climbed the whole drowned world to reach the stair. She had refused the note and beaten the guardian as herself. She had emptied her own life to keep the one person who'd kept her a person, and in the keeping, had been bound to him forever. And now, grey and past grey, spent past spending, with the stair at last lying open above her toward the grey memory of light, Wren felt her emptied body finally fail, and she began, gently, to sink into the black water at the foot of the open stair. And the water went still. Not the stillness of her still song, not any stillness she had made or ever could. The whole black water of the shaft, the whole deep, from the foot of the stair down into the drowned world and up toward the grey light, went utterly, completely, impossibly still, as though the sea itself had stopped, as though something vast had drawn a breath and held it, and in the stillness, a voice that was not a voice, that was the held song of the whole deep speaking at once, that came up out of the drowned world and the salt beneath everything, and the 1,000-year silence the church had built its power upon, spoke into the joined and fading mind of the girl who had just unmade its guardian. Well, there you are. It has been a very long time since anyone came all the way down. Do not sink just yet, small maker. You have done a great thing, and a terrible one, and now you and I must talk about what you have broken. She did not sink. The stillness held her the way the death song had unheld her, and she hung in the black water at the foot of the open stair, grey and emptied and barely alive, with Barnacle broken but breathing pressed against her. And she listened, because there was nothing else left to do, to the thing that had spoken. It did not show itself. She understood that it could not, or would not, that it was not a thing with a shape to show, that it was the stillness itself, the held voice of the whole deep, and that it was speaking to her from everywhere and from below everything, up out of the salt, beneath the salt. But she could feel where it was. It was down, below the drowned city, below the foundry city, below the deepest districts she had crossed, at the true bottom of the undertide. And it was bound there. She felt that clearly, bound the way she had been sealed, only vaster and older and more terrible. A thing held in place by a working so old the drowned city was young beside it. A thing that had been down there in the dark, waiting, since before the old world sang itself apart. "You cannot answer me in words," the voice observed, without impatience, without warmth, without anything Wren could name except a vast and ancient attention. "He took your voice, the old one. I can feel the seal, and I can feel that you have begun, foolishly and bravely, to open it. And I can feel what he hid beneath it, which you have not yet reached, and which I will not tell you, because it is not mine to tell, and because you are more interesting not knowing. No matter. You need not speak. I have listened to the drowned world for longer than your church has had a name, and I can hear you, the way you have learned at last to hear. Be still and be heard." And Wren, having no choice, was still and was heard. And the thing in the deep listened to her the way she had learned to listen, all the way down, and knew her. Knew the cliff and the cottage and the old man's sacrifice. Knew the seal and the fall and the long climb. Knew Barnacle and the plaza and the causeway and the note. Knew the socket where Halden's lesson had been. Knew that she had refused the note at the warden and won as herself, and emptied her life to keep her grail. Knew all of it in a single long draught of attention, the way she'd read a fish, the way she'd read the drowned carving on the first day. So, it said, when it had read her whole. A wild singer's apprentice, sealed and thrown down and grown wild in my dark. You have climbed my whole world, small maker. You have done what no living thing has done in an age. You have unmade my warden and opened my stair. I should be angry. I find I am not. I find I am something I had almost forgotten how to be, which is interested. Let me tell you what you have done, since no one above will ever tell you the truth. And the truth is the only thing I have left to give, and the only thing you have not yet stolen or earned. You wish to know what the undertide is truly for. Your church says it is a grave. The reef folk say it is unfinished work. The reef folk are closer, but they do not know what the work was. And I do. The old world did not sing itself apart. That is a lie, small maker. The church's oldest and most necessary lie, the lie beneath all their other lies, the lie their whole silence is built to protect. The old world did not destroy itself with too much singing. The old world was destroyed by something else. It does not matter now what, it was very long ago, and it came from outside, and it drowned the coast and broke the world's shape. And the makers of the old world, the great makers, the founders whose bells you have walked among, they did not cause the drowning. They fought it. They sang against it. And when they could not stop it, they did the only thing left. They began a working, the greatest held song ever sung. A working meant to hold the broken coast together, to keep the sea from taking everything, to hold the world in a kind of tuned and stable grief until it could, someday, be finished and made whole. They did not finish it. They ran out of time, or out of makers, or out of world. They sang the great working as far as they could, and then they died. And the sea came, and the working was left unfinished, held but not complete. A song stopped in the middle of its resolving, holding the coast together in a tension that was meant to be temporary and has lasted 1,000 years. That is what the undertide is. It is not a grave. It is an unfinished working the size of a coastline, a held song still ringing, still holding, still waiting for someone to finish it. And it is failing. It has always been failing, slowly, the way the iron grate you broke was failing, the way all held things fail. And your church knows. Your church has always known. That is the true secret beneath their silence. Wren, hanging grey and emptied in the still black water, listened and understood, and felt the whole shape of her life reorder itself around the thing in the deep's words. The church does not forbid tuning because it will drown the world, the voice went on, remorseless, patient. The church forbids tuning because the great unfinished working must someday be finished, and finishing it will require makers, wild singers, free tuners, listeners like you, singing the old world song to its resolution at last. And the church cannot allow that. Do you understand why? Because the church is not made of makers. The church is made of what it calls sanctioned bells. And a sanctioned bell, small maker, is a bell that has been founded and then set, its tuning fixed, its held song locked, made permanent and unchangeable so that it can never be tuned again. That is the whole of the church's art. They do not make, they set. They take a thing that could sing, and they fix its song forever so it can never change. And they call the fixing holy. And they hang their set and silenced bells in every tower on the coast. And they teach that the setting is the highest craft, and the free singing is the deepest sin. Because a set bell cannot finish the working. A set bell cannot retune. The church has built its whole power on the setting of songs. And the great working needs the unsetting of songs. And so the church must hunt every freemaker on the coast forever. Because every freemaker is the thing that could finish the work the church has spent 1,000 years making sure is never finished. They chose the silence, small maker. Long ago, the ones who became your church, they found the unfinished working and understood it. And they understood that finishing it was the world's only hope, and also the end of any power built on the present broken order. And they chose the broken order. They chose to hold the coast in its failing grief forever, rather than risk the change that finishing the work would bring. They set their bells, and they hunted the makers, and they called the drowned world a grave, so no one would come down and hear the truth still ringing in the stone. Your old one on the cliff, he knew. That was his heresy. Not the tuning of flesh, the knowing. He was a founder once, a setter of bells, and he learned what the setting was for, and he could not bear it. And he became a wild singer, to keep the free craft alive, because the free craft is the only thing that can finish the work, and he died to pass it to you. The socket in her memory ached. She thought of Halden's last words, "There's salt beneath everything, girl." Under the church, under the drowned towns, under the whole tided coast. Salt and the old song, and the truth they buried. If you ever get somewhere quiet enough to listen, listen for it. It's been waiting a long time to be finished. He had known. He had known all of it, and he had begun to tell her, "That's the part I've never told you. One day I will, when you're ready." And the church had come up the cliff before he could, and he had locked the reason away in her throat, under the seal, along with whatever else he'd hidden there. The rest of what he owed her. The reason he'd died. She had climbed a whole drowned world to reach the truth. And here it was, given freely by a bound and ancient thing at the bottom of the dark. And it was worse and larger than any private grief. And now the thing in the deep said, and for the first time something entered its voice that was almost like feeling. Not warmth, but a kind of terrible, patient irony. "Now we come to what you have broken, small maker, and why we are talking at all." My warden was part of the working. Wren went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the water. Not a guardian set upon the stair to keep out thieves, whatever the carvings told you. That is what it became, in the church's telling, in the reef folks' fear. A monster on a stair. But it was made by the old world, in the last days, as part of the great held song. It stood at the throat of the deep, and it sang. And its singing was not merely a wall, its singing was a held note, one of the great sustained notes of the unfinished working, a note the old makers left ringing to hold their song in place while they went to sing the next part, a note that is held for 1,000 years, keeping the whole vast unfinished working from unraveling any faster than it already does. The warden's death song and the working's holding note were the same song. To cross its territory, anything living had to be unmade, yes, but that was the side of it that faced you. The side that faced down, into the working, was a keystone. And you, small maker, brave and desperate and refusing the easy way, you found its fault, and you sang it apart along its own honest resolution. And you have unstopped the note. The stillness deepened. Wren felt it in the joining, in her emptied body, in the ache of the socket and the ache of the scar, the sense of something vast and long-held beginning, very slowly, to move. You have not destroyed the working. It is far too large for that. But you have removed one of its held notes, the keystone note, the one at the throat of the deep. And the working has begun, for the first time in 1,000 years, to resolve, to move, to sing the next part of itself at last, because the note that was holding it still is gone. This is not destruction, small maker. This may even be, in the long unspooling of ages, the beginning of the finishing your old one died for. But it is change. And the coast above you has been held in one shape for 1,000 years, and knows no other, and it is not ready. When a held song 1,000 years old begins to resolve, the things built upon its stillness will shift. The sea will move where it has not moved in an age. The drowned will stir. The set bells in the church towers, fixed and unable to retune, will find the world tuning around them, and be able to answer none of it. And the change will fall, as change always falls, not on the church in its high set towers, but on the low and the free and the unset, on the fishers and the marsh folk and the wild singers, on the ones with songs still loose enough to sing back to a changing world. You have quickened the finishing. You did it to save your grail and to keep yourself yourself. Which are good reasons, small reasons, the only reasons anyone ever does anything that matters. And the whole coast will pay for it and be remade by it, and none of them will know your name. Wren hung in the stillness and received the whole weight of it, and it was too large to hold, and she held it anyway, because there was no one else to hold it, and because holding what was too large had become, somewhere in the long descent, the thing she did. You want to ask me for help, the thing in the deep said, reading her. You want to ask me to hold it back, to re-stop the note, to give the coast more time. I will not, and I cannot, and I would not if I could. I cannot, because the warden is unmade, and I am bound and cannot rise to make another. I will not, because I have been down here in the dark, holding the failing grief of a dead world for longer than you can conceive, small maker. And I am so tired of holding. And you have done the one thing that begins, at last, to unhold it. And I find that I am glad, in the cold way that is all the gladness I have left. And I would not, because the finishing is right. Your old one was right. The church is wrong to hold the world in its broken shape forever, out of fear of the change that would heal it. The finishing should happen. It is only that it will hurt, and that the hurt will fall on the innocent, and that you have set it moving before anyone is ready, and that no one asked you to carry that, and now you must. I will give you what I can give, which is not rescue. I will give you knowledge, which you have earned, and one thing more. The knowledge is this. The church cannot save the coast from what comes, because their bells are set and cannot retune, and only retuning can answer a resolving world. When the sea moves, and the drowned stir, and the old shapes shift, the high church in its towers will ring its fixed and holy bells, and the bells will answer nothing, because a set song cannot sing to a changing world. The saving, if there is saving, will fall to the makers, to the free and the unset. To the wild singers, the church has spent 1,000 years hunting nearly to nothing. To the ones who can still listen to a changing thing and sing back to it what it needs. There are not many of you left. Your old one was one. You are one. You will have to find the others and teach the craft and keep it alive and free. Not because it is your fault the change has come, though it is, but because you are one of the very few things standing between the coast and a change with no one left to shape it. That is the burden. You climbed down here to escape the church and to avenge an old man and to see the sky again. And you will climb out carrying the fate of a coastline. And it is not fair, and it is yours. And the one thing more, the thing in the deep said, is that you have earned your voice. And I will not take back what you have opened, but I will not open it further either. That is your work, and dangerous, and not for here. What I will do is this. You reached, through your grail, all the way down to my warden's fault, into ranges no living tuner has touched in an age. You did not merely borrow that reach. You are joined to him now, past any parting. I can feel it. The soul tie, the old forbidden thing, set permanent in the two of you. Because of it, you hear as no living maker hears. You have reached the deepest register there is, not by widening your own throat, which is scarred and will never widen so far, but by joining a hearing that reaches where yours cannot. You have what the old founders had at their greatest, the whole range, from the surface hum to the deep-held songs. Through the two of you together, guard it. It is the finishing craft. It is the thing that could someday sing the working whole. It is also the thing the church will kill you and everyone you love to prevent when they learn it walks the coast again. And they will learn. The one who came up your cliff, the one who took your old one, he does not know you survived. Yet. He will. The stillness began, very slightly, to ease. Wren felt the hole deep, drawing its held breath toward release. Felt the thing in the deep turning its vast attention back toward the working, and the long resolving it would now, at last, get to feel begin. Go up, small maker. The stair is open. I opened it, or you did. It comes to the same. Take your grail, whom you have kept, and who has kept you, and climb into the grey light your church has told everyone is forbidden, and see the truth for yourself, that the drowned world was never a grave, and never damned, and only unfinished. And now, because of you, beginning at last, to finish. I would tell you to be careful, but you have not been careful once since you fell, and it has served you. I would tell you that you are the coast's only hope, but that is too large and too cruel to lay on a girl who wanted only to see the sky. So I will tell you the true thing, the small thing, the thing your old one would tell you if he were here, wherever he is, and I do not know where he is before you ask. I know he was taken, and I know his body did not come down to me. And beyond that, his fate is above, not below, and yours to find. The true thing is this. You refused the note. At the very end, with everything to gain and your own life to lose, you refused the strength that needs no one, and chose the strength that is shared. And it cost you your body's last salt, and nearly your life. And it won you a slower, harder, wholer victory. And you climbed out of my dark as yourself, remembering the old man you love, joined to the person you saved. That is the finishing craft too, small maker. Not the reaching of the register, the refusing of the wolf. Remember it when the burden is heavy, and the note whispers that it would all be so much easier alone and afraid of nothing. It would be easier. It would also be the end of you, and the end of everything you climbed out to keep. You have already proven you can refuse it. Prove it again, every day, forever. And you may yet finish what the old world began. Now go. And when you find the one who took your old one, and you will, remember that he has a set bell for a soul, fixed and holy, and unable to sing to anything it did not already believe, and that you have the whole range, and that this is why you will win in the end, though it will cost you as everything costs you. Go up. And the stillness broke. The held breath of the whole deep released, gently, and the black water moved again, and the thing in the deep withdrew its vast attention back down into the bound dark where it waited, tired and ancient, and for the first time in 1,000 years, feeling its long-held song begin to resolve beneath it. And Wren, hanging emptied and marked and joined at the foot of the open stair, felt the weight settle onto her fully, the truth, the burden, the fate of a coast, and felt underneath it, holding it up, the low, warm, permanent thread of barnacle in her, broken and breathing and hers. And she found that she could bear it, because she did not have to bear it alone. She was not going to sink. She had come too far to sink. She reached inward, to the founder's tools and the loosed thread of her voice and the scarred, vast register the joining had given her. And she took stock, the way Halden had taught her, the way she always would. Her body was emptied, but not dead. Her leg had long since knit, a limp she barely felt now. Her voice was partway loosed and would stay so. She had the high register now, hers, and through barnacle the whole range beneath. The held song of listening was in her, and the memory of the mother bell, and the truth of the old world, and the burden of the finishing. She had climbed the whole drowned world. She had refused the wolf. She had inherited her master's craft and, now, at last, is reason. The whole of it. The thing he died with half told, given back to her by the deep. She knew why he died. She did not know if he lived, or where his body had gone, or whether the church had taken his secret or only his life. That was above. That was hers to find. She turned to Barnacle in the moving water. He was grievously hurt and slowly mending, and would carry the warden's mark down his whole length forever, as she carried her scars. He pushed at her, faint but certain through the permanent joining, the shape of everything he'd heard, everything the deep had said, and under it, a warmth that had no fear left in it at all, only resolve, and a question that was really an answer. Up, then. Together. Up. And Wren pushed back the last thing she needed to push. The thing that turned all the grief of the whole long descent into the thing she would carry it as from now on. Not sorrow, not vengeance, not even hope exactly, but resolve, banked and hot, and hers. Up, together. And then we find out what they did to him, and we find the others, and we keep the craft free, and we finish what he died for. All of it. Together. Up. She set her hand to Barnacle's warm, broken flank, and turned toward the rising stair, and began at last, after the whole drowned world, to climb toward the light. The climb up was nothing like the fall down. The fall had been an instant that held a life. The climb was long and slow and physical, a thing measured in steps and in breath. And Wren was glad of it, glad of every worn stone step under her bare feet, glad of the burn in her emptied body, glad of the plain, honest labor of putting one foot above the other. Because after the vastness of the thing in the deep and the weight it had laid on her, she needed the smallness of a stair, the ordinariness of climbing, the human scale of a girl and a hurt grail, making their slow way up out of the dark toward a smudge of grey that grew, step by step, into something more. Barnacle could not climb as she climbed, but the stair, she found, had a channel cut alongside it. The old world had thought of everything, or of grails at least, and where the stair spiraled up the shaft, a flooded channel spiraled with it, so that Barnacle could half swim, half haul himself up through the water at her side. Slow and pained, and unwilling to be more than an arm's length from her, the joining between them a taut, warm thread that neither of them let stretch. They went up together. They rested often on the broad, worn steps, and Wren wicked what corruption she could from Barnacle's long wound, a little at a time, and Barnacle brought her the last few blind fish from the flooded channel, and between them they climbed, and the grey grew. And as they climbed, she tested herself. She did it carefully on the resting steps, because the thing in the deep had said her voice was hers now, and dangerous, and not for down here. But she could not help it. She had been silent for the whole descent, sealed and humming, and now the seal was partway loosed, and she had to know what she had. So on a resting step, high in the shaft, with the grey almost close enough to be called light, she opened her partway loosed throat, and she sang. It was not much, a thread of high-register song, ragged where the seal still gripped, painful where the founder's needle had opened her, but it was open song, carrying song, the thing the seal had forbidden her the whole long descent, and it came out of her into the shaft and rang off the old, worn stone, and she heard it, her own voice, loosed, for the first time since the cliff. And the sound of it undid her a little, because the last open song she'd heard from her own throat had been the one Halden sealed, and the last open song she'd heard at all had been his, loud in the dark so she could get away. She sang a small, honest working to test it. She found a fault in the stone of the resting step, an old crack the water had been working at, and she sang it apart the maker's way, the held song of listening, finding the stone's true undoing. And the stone came away clean and easy, no over-temper, no wolf, just craft, honest and loosed, and hers. And then, greatly daring, she reached, through Barnacle, through the permanent joining, down past her scarred high register, into the deep ranges only he could hear. And she felt it there, the whole range, the finishing craft the deep had named, hers now through the two of them. A girl's scarred voice joined to a grail's deep hearing, making, together, something no living tuner had been in an age. She did not sing anything from the deep range. She only touched it, and felt it there, and drew back, because it was too much for a resting step, and she knew it. But she had it. She was a maker with the whole range, loosed and joined and scarred and free. And she had climbed out of the dark as herself, and she let the knowledge of it settle into her alongside the burden, so that the two balanced, the terrible weight of what she'd quickened and the real strength of what she'd become. And behind the loosed voice, deep in her throat under the partway broken seal, she felt the other thing stir. The heavy, hidden thing Halden had locked away along with her silence. The rest of what he owed her. The thing the deep had refused to name. The partial unsealing had loosed her voice, but not that. That lay deeper, behind more of the seal than the founder's needle had opened, and she could feel it there now, closer than before, a locked weight waiting behind her loosed song. When you're grown and ready, and someone teaches you to open your own throat. She was not ready yet. She had loosed her voice the fast, terrible way to face the warden, but the full unsealing, the reaching of the last hidden thing, was still ahead of her, still dangerous, still work for the world above. But it was there. It was hers to reach, someday. One more thing waiting at the top of a stair. She stopped singing. The thread of her voice died away into the shaft, and Barnacle pushed at her a warmth of pride and wonder. You sing. I heard you sing. That is your voice. That is the first time I have heard your voice. And Wren realized he was right. He had known her the whole descent only as a silent thing, a hummer, a sender of impressions, and this was the first time he had ever heard her open voice, the first sound she had ever made that he could hear the way anyone heard. And the wonder in him was so simple and so total that she laughed her silent laugh again and pressed her forehead to his wet head, and they rested a while longer, high in the shaft, in the grey, growing light. The girl who had her voice back, and the Grail, who had never heard it until now. Then they climbed the last of it, and the grey became light, and the light became a mouth of stone open to the sky, and they came up out of the undertide into the world. It was dawn, and it was grey, and it was the most beautiful thing Wren had ever seen. The stair gave out into a sea cave, a great mouth of chalk open to the shore, and beyond the mouth was the moor, the cold grey sea, moving, breathing, loud. The first loud thing she'd heard in an age that was not a working or a horror, just the honest roar of surf on shingle. And above the sea was the sky, low and grey and vast and endless, and the light of it, the plain grey daylight of the Sindran coast at dawn, poured into the cave mouth and onto Wren's face, and she stood in it and could not move. She had thought she might weep coming up. She did not weep. She stood in the grey light with the sea roaring and the sky enormous overhead, and she breathed and breathed, and felt the light on her skin, and the wind off the moor in her salt, stiff hair. And she was aware, distantly, of tears on her face. But they were not weeping tears. They were just her body's honest answer to the light. The way the fish had wept brine when she wicked it, her own salt coming to the surface to meet the sky. She had climbed out. She was on the surface. She had done the thing she'd sworn at the bottom of the fall. I'm coming up, and I'm going to be worth something by the time I do. And she was up, and she was worth something. And the grey light of the world above poured over her and told her it was real. Barnacle hauled himself up out of the flooded stair, into the cave mouth beside her, into the light, and Wren watched a sea beast see the sky for the first time in longer than she'd been in the dark. Watched him go still, his blunt head raised, his dark eyes finding the grey light and the moving sea beyond, and felt through the joining the enormous, uncomplicated joy of it. The reef child seeing water again, open water, sea water, home water. The cold, hollow ache in him easing, not because it was healed, but because here, at last, was the sea. The world's whole sea. And beyond it somewhere, the reefs he'd been swept from. He pushed at her a joy so large it had no shape, and dragged himself to the cave mouth, and put his head out into the wind off the moor, and made a sound she had never heard from him. Not the keening, not the sending. An open sound. A grail's true voice. A long, low, belling call that rolled out over the surf toward the grey sea and the distant, unseen reefs. The first time in the whole long dark he had ever called out loud to his own kind, the way she had just, on the stair, sung out loud for the first time to hers. And then they stood together in the cave mouth, the girl and the grail, both loosed, both loud, both up, and looked out at the changed shore. And Wren saw that it was changed. She had climbed out expecting the coast she'd fallen from. She found a coast already answering the things she'd done. The tide was wrong. That was the first thing she saw. Standing in the cave mouth with the surf roaring, the tide was out, far out, further than she had ever seen it on any shore of the Sindran coast. The grey sea drawn back from the shingle across flats of wet sand and drowned rock that no living fisher had ever walked, as though the moor itself had taken a long breath in and not yet let it out. And on the exposed flats, in the grey dawn, lay things the sea had never given up before. Dark shapes of old, drowned wood, the ribs of ships 100 years lost, and further out, at the very edge of the drawn-back water, the broken tops of stone. Towers, she understood with a lurch. The drowned tops of towers. The highest roofs of some sunken town the sea had hidden for 1,000 years, standing up now into the grey air for the first time since the old world drowned. Because the sea had drawn back. Because the working had begun to resolve. Because she had unstopped the note. When a held song 1,000 years old begins to resolve, the things built upon its stillness will shift. The sea will move where it has not moved in an age. The thing in the deep had told her, and here it was, already, the very first morning, the sea moving where it had not moved in an age, drawing back off the coast, uncovering the drowned world it had hidden, beginning the long resolving that would remake the whole shore. She had thought the change might take years, generations, the slow unspooling the deep had spoken of. And it would take years, generations. But it had begun, this morning, this tide, and the beginning was already visible, already strange, already frightening. And it was hers. She stood in the cave mouth and looked at the drawn-back sea, and the drowned towers standing into the grey air, and understood the burden not as an idea now, but as a thing she could see with her eyes. The coast was changing. It would go on changing, faster and stranger, for the rest of her life, and long past it. And the people of the coast, the fishers who would walk out onto these new flats not knowing why the tide had drawn back, the marsh folk whose marshes would flood or drain, the whole low, free, unset world that lived on the edge of the moor. They would face the change with no idea what it was or why it had come, and their church would ring its set and holy bells at it and answer nothing. And the only ones who could truly answer, the makers, the wild singers, were hunted nearly to nothing. And she was one of the very few, and this was her doing. She did not look away from it. She had learned, in the dark, not to look away from what was too large. She looked at the changed shore and let it be as large as it was, and let it settle onto her fully, and found, as she had found at the foot of the stair, with the low, warm thread of barnacle holding her up, that she could bear it. Not lightly, but she could bear it. And then, along the top of the chalk cliffs above the drawn-back sea, small and distant in the grey dawn, she saw the lanterns. They were far off, a mile or more along the cliff top, a thin line of them moving in the grey light where the cliff road ran, and even at that distance, even after everything, her whole body went cold and still at the sight. Because she knew that line of lights. She had seen it once before, coming up her own cliff in the dark with merry bells. A patrol. A line of lanterns on the cliff road at dawn, moving with the slow, unhurried certainty of men who did their office. Sextons, out on the changed coast. And she understood with another cold lurch why they were out. Because the tide had drawn back. Because the drowned towers stood into the air. Because the coast had begun to change in the night, and the church had felt it. The way a spider feels its web plucked, and had sent its listeners out along the cliffs to find the cause, to find the crack in their silence, to find whatever had begun to unstop the working they had spent 1,000 years keeping still. To find her. Though they did not know it was her, did not know she existed, did not know that the girl who'd gone off the chalk scar in the night had lived and climbed the whole drowned world and unmade the keystone of their buried lie. They would find out. The one who came up your cliff, he will learn you survived, and they will learn the finishing craft walks the coast again, and they will kill you and everyone you love to prevent it. Not yet. But the line of lanterns on the cliff was the beginning of that too. The church already out, already hunting, already feeling the change she'd made and coming to find its source. And she was standing in a cave mouth on the open shore in the grey dawn where any listener on that cliff might, if the wind turned, hear a loosed voice or a grail's belling call. She dropped low, out of the cave mouth's grey light, and pulled Barnacle back with her into the shadow of the chalk, and the two of them watched the line of lanterns move along the distant cliff, and Wren felt the whole shape of the world above settle into place around her, the way the truth had settled at the foot of the stair. This was the coast now. This was what she'd climbed out into, a changing shore, and a hunting church, and a distant reckoning with the man who'd taken Halden, and the burden of a finishing no one had asked her to carry, and the low, warm thread of the one person who'd keep her herself through all of it. The dark had been simpler. The dark had only tried to kill her. The world above would try to do worse, to unmake her the way the note unmade her, from the inside, by making her hunted and alone and afraid until she reached for the wolf just to stop being afraid. She would not. She had proven she would not. She would prove it again, every day, forever, exactly as the deep had said. The line of lanterns passed along the cliff and dwindled and was gone, off to search some other stretch of the changed shore, not knowing what they searched for was crouched in a sea cave a mile below them, with the whole truth of their lie in her scarred and loosed throat. When they had gone, Wren let out a long breath, and Barnacle eased against her, and the grey dawn brightened over the drawn-back sea and the standing, drowned towers, and it was, for one more moment, quiet. They did not stay long. The changed shore was no safer than the deep, only differently dangerous. And a girl and a grail in a sea cave in the grey dawn were not hidden. So they moved. Down out of the cave mouth onto the wet, exposed flats, while the tide was drawn back, keeping to the shadow of the chalk, working their way along the shore toward the marsh country to the north, where Halden had told her an age ago that a small, quiet person could disappear. But before they went, on the wet flats in the grey light, Wren stopped, because there was a thing she had to do, a thing she had climbed the whole drowned world to be able to do, and she would not go north until it was done. She turned to Barnacle in the drawn-back sea, and she opened the joining all the way, the permanent thread between them, and she showed him the whole of it, not the fight, not the burden, but the purpose, the thing that had been forming in her since the causeway, and had set hard as the soul tie at the foot of the stair. She showed him Halden, the old man on the cliff, the sacrifice, the sealed voice, the reason locked in her throat, the whole open wound of not knowing whether he lived, or where the church had taken him, or whether they'd taken his secret, or only his life. She showed him the church, the set bells, the hunted makers, the 1,000-year lie, the man who'd come up her cliff. She showed him the finishing, the failing working, the resolving coast, the burden the deep had laid on her, the few free makers left, the craft that had to be kept alive and free. And she gathered all of it, the grief and the truth and the burden and the resolve, and she made it into a single shape, a purpose, a life's whole aim, and she pushed it at Barnacle so he would know exactly what he'd be staying for, if he stayed. I'm going to find out what they did to him. That first, that's mine. That's the wound. I have to know if he lives and where his body went, and whether they have his reason or only his life. And then I'm going to find the others, the freemakers, the wild singers the church has hunted nearly to nothing. And I'm going to keep the craft alive and free, and I'm going to teach it. And someday, with the whole range you gave me, I'm going to finish what the old world began and what he died for, or die trying. That's the rest of my life. That's what I climbed out to do. It's too large, and it's not fair, and it's mine. She made herself send the last of it truly, the part that was a question, the part that gave him the choice. And you don't have to carry it. You're a grail. Your reefs are out there, past the moor. You're free of the dark and free of the iron, and you could go home, to your own kind, to the sea, to the reefs you were swept from. And the cold, hollow ache would ease at last, and no church would hunt you, and no burden would be yours. You've kept me, all the way down and all the way up. You've done enough. You've done more than enough. You could go home now, and I would not. It cost her to send it. I would not blame you, and I would not stop being yours, joined like this wherever you went. You could go home. Barnacle received all of it, on the wet flats in the grey light, with the drawn-back sea moving around them and the reefs somewhere out past the moor. And he was quiet a long moment, the way he'd been quiet on the causeway before he vowed to keep her herself. And then he lifted his blunt head, and he looked out at the grey sea, at the open water, at the home that lay somewhere past it, looked at it long enough that Wren felt her heart go cold, thinking he would take it, thinking she had given him the door and he would walk through it, as he should, as she'd told him he could. And then he turned his back on the sea, deliberately, and put his head against her, and pushed at her the clearest, largest, most final impression of the whole long descent. The word that had made a company of them in the plaza and a bond of them at the stair, only now chosen freely, on the open shore, with the way home in plain sight, and refused. together. I heard the reef in my own call, Wren, when I belled out into the wind. It is out there. I could go, and I am not going. The reef is my kind, but you are my person. And the reef swept me away, and you kept me, and the dark would have had me, and you freed me. And I am joined to you past any parting, and I do not want it undone. Your wound is my wound now. Your church is my church to hunt. Your finishing is my finishing. I am not staying because you need me to keep you, though you do, and I will. I am staying because there is nowhere on the whole coast or in the whole sea I would rather be than beside you, carrying the too large thing, refusing the wolf, being loud and up and free. I choose it. I choose the exile from the reef and the burden and you. Together. All of it together. And Wren, who had not wept coming up out of the dark, who had not wept at the grey light or the open sky, wept now, silently, the old way, her whole body shaking with it, not from grief this time, but from the sheer, unbearable gift of it. The Grail choosing her over the sea, the person choosing her over home. And she got her arms around his neck as far as they'd go, exactly as she had in the plaza when she named him, and pressed her face into his wet fur and shook, and pushed back at him the only thing large enough to answer it, which was everything. All of it. Her whole self held out and given. Together. Then. Thank you. Together. I love you. Together. All the way. To the end of it. I will not go alone into any of it. Thank you for choosing me. Together. And the grief that she had carried since the cliff, banked and hot for the whole long descent, changed at last. Not gone, not healed. It would never be gone or healed. But changed, forged, turned from the stone it had been into something she could carry and use, into resolve, into purpose, into the fuel of a life's whole aim, the way an over-tempered working sets permanent into the thing it marks. Halden was gone, or lost, or waiting to be found. The coast was changing and hunting her, and the church's lie stood exposed only in her throat, and the reckoning stretched ahead of her longer than she could see. And she was up, and she was loosed, and she had the whole range, and she was not, and would never again be, alone. They went north along the changed shore as the tide began, at last, to turn, the drawn-back sea starting its slow return over the exposed flats and the standing, drowned towers, the long resolving beginning its work on a coast that did not yet know it had begun. Wren pulled her salt-stiff hood up against the grey light and kept to the shadow of the chalk, and Barnacle swam the returning water at her side, close, the joining a taut, warm thread neither of them let stretch, and the two of them made their slow way toward the marsh country, where a girl and a Grail might disappear, and gather strength, and begin. She did not know if Halden lived. She did not know where the church had taken him, or whether they held his secret or only his bones, and the not knowing sat in her still, but banked now toward purpose. A wound turned into a road. North to the marshes, and then out onto the changing coast, to find his fate, and find the others, and keep the craft free, and someday finish the song. She did not know how long it would take, or whether she would live to see it, or how much the reckoning with the man who'd come up her cliff would cost her before the end. She knew only the true things, the small things, the things the deep had told her to hold onto when the burden grew heavy, that she had refused the wolf and won as herself, and that she carried the whole of her master's craft and his reason both, and that she was not alone. At the edge of the marsh country, where the chalk gave way to reeds and the returning tide pushed up into the salt channels, Wren stopped once more and looked back, south, along the changed shore, toward the sea cave and the drowned stair, and the deep beneath it, where the thing in the deep waited, tired and ancient, and for the first time in 1,000 years, feeling its long-held song begin to resolve. And she looked up at the grey sky, low and vast and endless over the moving sea, and she opened her partway loosed throat, and she sang, just a thread, just a small, loosed, high note, quiet enough that no listener on any cliff would catch it. The first open song she had ever chosen to sing for no reason, but that she could, that she was up, that she was free, that she was herself. It was not much of a song. It was ragged where the seal still gripped, and thin where the founder's needle had opened her, and it carried in it the whole weight of everything: the cliff, the fall, the dark, the note refused, the warden unmade, the truth, the burden, the Grail, who had chosen her over the sea. But it was hers, loosed and free and open under the grey sky, the voice her master had sealed to save her, and the deep had given back. And Barnacle heard it, and lifted his head, and belled out low beside her over the returning tide, his true voice answering her true voice, the two of them, loud and up and free, on the edge of the changed world, singing back to a coast that had begun, because of them, to change. Then Wren let the note die, and pulled her hood close, and turned north into the reeds with the Grail at her side, toward the marsh country and the long work waiting beyond it. And the two of them went on together into the grey morning of the changed shore, and did not look back again.